Part 8 of Batwing by Sax Rohmer, read by Mark Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Batwing, Chapter 22, Cullen Camber's Secret. "I brought this Batwing from Haiti," he explained, replacing it in the tray. "It was found beneath the pillow of a Negro missionary who had died mysteriously during the night." He returned the tray to the drawer, closed the latter, and, standing erect, raised clenched hands above his head. "With no thought of blasphemy," he said, "but with reverence, I thank God from the bottom of my heart that Juan Menendez is dead." He reseated himself, whilst Harley regarded him silently. Then, "The evil that men do lives after them," he murmured. He rested his chin upon his hand. "A batwing," he continued musingly. "A batwing was nailed to Menendez's door." He stared across at Harley. "Am I to believe, sir, that this was the clue which led you to the guest-house?" Paul Harley nodded. "It was." "I understand. I must therefore take no more excursions into my special subject, but must endeavor to regard the matter from the point of view of the inquiry. Am I to assume that Menendez was acquainted with the significance of this token?" "He had seen it employed in the West Indies." "Ah, the black-hearted devil! But I fear I am involving myself more deeply in suspicion. Perhaps, Mr. Harley, the ends of justice would be better served if you were to question me, and I to confine myself to answering you." "Very well," Harley agreed. "When and where did you meet the late Colonel Menendez?" "I never met him in my life." "Do you mean that you have never spoken to him?" "Never." Tell me, Mr. Camber, where were you at 12 o'clock last night?" "Here, writing." "And where was Ah Tsong?" "Ah Tsong?" Cullen Camber stared uncomprehendingly. "Ah Tsong was in bed." "Oh. Did anything disturb you?" "Yes. The sound of a rifle shot." "You knew it for a rifle shot?" "It was unmistakable." "What did you do?" "I was in the midst of a most important passage, and I should probably have taken no steps in the matter, but that Ah Tsong knocked upon the study door, to inform me that my wife had been awaked by the sound of the shot. She is somewhat nervous, and had rung for Ah Tsong, asking him to see if all were well with me." "Do I understand that she imagined the sound to have come from this room?" "When we are newly awake from sleep, Mr. Harley, we retain only an imperfect impression of that which awakened us." "True," replied Paul Harley. "And did Ah Tsong return to his room?" "Not immediately. Permit me to say, Mr. Harley, that the nature of your question surprises me. At the moment I fail to see their bearing upon the main issue. He returned and reported to my wife that I was writing, and she then requested him to bring her a glass of milk. Accordingly, he came down again, and going out to the kitchen, executed this order." "Ah, he would have to light a candle for that purpose, I suppose?" "A candle or a lamp," replied Cullen Camber, staring at Paul Harley. Then, his expression altering, "Of course," he cried, "you saw the light from Cray's Folly. I understand at last." We were silent for a while, until— "How long a time elapsed between the firing of the shot and Ah Tsong's knocking at the study door?" asked Harley. "I could not answer definitely. I was absorbed in my work, but probably only a minute or two." "Was the sound a loud one?" "Fairly loud, and very startling, of course, in the silence of the night." "The shot, then, was fired from somewhere quite near the house?" "I presume so." "But you thought no more about the matter?" "Frankly, I had forgotten it. You see, the neighborhood is rich with game. It might have been a poacher." "Quite," murmured Harley, but his face was very stern. "I wonder if you fully realize the danger of your position, Mr. Camber?" "Believe me," was the reply, "I can anticipate almost every question which I shall be called upon to answer." Paul Harley stared at him in a way which told me that he was comparing his features line for line with the etching of Edgar Allan Poe which hung in his office in Chancery Lane. And, "I do believe you," he replied, "and I am wondering if you are in a position to clear yourself." On the contrary, Camber assured him, I am only waiting to hear that Juan Menendez was shot in the grounds of Cray's Folly, and not within the house, to propose to you that unless the real assassin be discovered, I shall quite possibly pay the penalty of this crime." "He was shot in the Tudor garden," replied Harley, "within sight of your windows." "Ah," Colin Camber resumed the task of stuffing shag into his corncob. "Then, if it would interest you, Mr. Harley, I will briefly outline the case against myself. I had never troubled to disguise the fact that I hated Menendez. Many witnesses can be called to testify to this. He was in Cuba when I was in Cuba, and evidence is doubtless obtainable to show that we stayed at the same hotels in various cities of the United States prior to my coming to England and leasing the guest-house. Finally, he became my neighbour in Surrey." He carefully lighted his pipe, whilst Harley and I watched him silently. Then, "Menendez had the bat-wing nailed to the door of his house," he continued. "He believed himself to be in danger, and associated this sign with the source of his danger. Excepting himself, and possibly certain other members of his household, it is improbable that any one else in Surrey understands the significance of the token save myself. The unholy rites of voodoo are a closed book to the Western nations. I have opened that book, Mr. Harley. The powers of the obeah man, and especially of the arch-magician known and dreaded by every Negro as Batwing, are familiar to me. Since I was alone at the time that the shot was fired, and for some few minutes afterward, and since the Tudor garden of Cray's Folly is within easy range of the guest-house, to fail to place me under arrest would be an act of sheer stupidity." He spoke the words with a sort of triumph. Like the fakir, he possessed the art of spiritual detachment, which is an attribute of genius. From an intellectual eminence he was surveying his own peril. Colin Camber in the flesh had ceased to exist. He was merely a pawn in a fascinating game. Paul Harley glanced at his watch. "Mr. Camber," he said, "I have just sustained the most crushing defeat of my career. The man who had summoned me to his aid was killed almost before my eyes. One thing I must do, or accept professional oblivion." "I understand," Colin Camber nodded. "Apprehend his murderer?" "Ultimately, yes. But firstly, I must see that to the assassination of Colonel Menendez a judicial murder is not added." "You mean?" asked Camber eagerly. "I mean that if you killed Menendez, you are a madman, and I have formed the opinion during our brief conversation that you are brilliantly sane." Colin Camber rose and bowed in that old-world fashion which was his. "I am obliged to you, Mr. Harley," he replied. "But has Mr. Knox informed you of my bibulous habits?" Paul Harley nodded. "They will, of course, be ascribed," continued Camber, "and there are many suitable analogies, to deliberate contemplation of a murderous deed. I would remind you that chronic alcoholism is a recognized form of insanity." His mood changed again, and sighing wearily he lay back in the chair. Over his pale face crept an expression which I knew, instinctively, to mean that he was thinking of his wife. "Mr. Harley," he said, speaking in a very low tone which scorned to accentuate the beauty of his voice, "I have suffered much in the quest of truth. Suffering is the gate beyond which we find compassion. Perhaps you have thought my foregoing remarks frivolous, in view of the fact that last night a soul was sent to its reckoning almost at my doors. I revere the truth, however, above all lesser laws and above all expediency. I do not, and I cannot, regret the end of the man Menendez. But for 3 reasons I should regret to pay the penalty of a crime which I did not commit. These reasons are, 1, he ticked them off upon his delicate fingers, it would be bitter to know that Devil Menendez even in death had injured me. 2, my work in the world, which is unfinished. And 3, my wife. I watched and listened, almost awed by the strangeness of the man who sat before me. His 3 reasons were illuminating. A casual observer might have regarded Colin Camber as a monument of selfishness, but it was evident to me, and I knew it must be evident to Paul Harley, that his egotism was quite selfless. To a natural human resentment and a pathetic love for his wife, he had added, as an equal clause, the claim of the world upon his genius. "I have heard you," said Paul Harley quietly, "and you have led me to the most important point of all." "What point is that, Mr. Harley?" "You have referred to your recent lapse from abstemiousness. Excuse me if I discuss personal matters. This you ascribed to domestic troubles, or so Mr. Knox has informed me. You have also referred to your undisguised hatred of the late Colonel Juan Menendez. I am going to ask you, Mr. Camber, to tell me quite frankly what was the nature of those domestic troubles, and what had caused this hatred which survives even the death of its object." Colin Camber stood up, angular, untidy, but a figure of great dignity. "Mr. Harley," he replied, "I cannot answer your questions." Paul Harley inclined his head gravely. "May I suggest," he said, "that you will be called upon to do so under circumstances which would brook no denial." Colin Camber watched him unflinchingly. "The fate of every man is hung around his neck," he replied. "Yet, in this secret history which you refuse to divulge, and which therefore must count against you, the truth may lie which exculpates you." "It may be so, but my determination remains unaltered." "Very well," answered Paul Harley quietly, but I could see that he was exercising a tremendous restraint upon himself. "I respect your decision, but you have given me a giant's task, and for this I cannot thank you, Mr. Camber." I heard a car pull up in the road outside the guest-house. Colin Camber clenched his hands and sat down again in the carved chair. "The opportunity has passed," said Harley. "The police are here." Chapter 23. Inspector Aylesbury Cross-Examines. "Oh, I see," said Inspector Aylesbury. "A little private confab, eh?" He sank his chin into his enveloping folds, treating Harley and myself each to a stare of disapproval. "These gentlemen very kindly called to advise me of the tragic occurrence at Cray's Folly," explained Colin Camber. "Won't you be seated, Inspector?" "Thanks, but I can conduct my examination better standing." He turned to Paul Harley. "Might I ask, Mr. Harley," he said, "what concern this is of yours?" "I am naturally interested in anything appertaining to the death of a client, Inspector Aylesbury." "Oh, so you slip in ahead of me, having deliberately withheld information from the police, and think you are going to get all the credit. Is that it?" "That is it, Inspector," replied Harley, smiling. "An instance of professional jealousy." "Professional jealousy!" cried the inspector. "Allow me to remind you that you have no official standing in this case whatever. You are merely a member of the public, nothing more, nothing less." "I am happy to be recognized as a member of that much misunderstood body." "Ah, well, we shall see. Now, Mr. Camber, your attention, please." He raised his finger impressively. "I am informed by Miss Beverley that the late Colonel Menendez looked upon you as a dangerous enemy." "Were those her exact words?" I murmured. "Mr. Knox!" The inspector turned rapidly, confronting me. "I have already warned your friend, but if I have any interruptions from you, I will have you removed." He continued to glare at me for some moments, and then, turning again to Colin Camber, "I say, I have information that Colonel Menendez looked upon you as a dangerous neighbour." "In that event," replied Colin Camber, "why did he lease me an adjoining property?" "That's an evasion, sir. Answer my first question, if you please." "You have asked me no question, Inspector." "Oh, I see. That's your attitude, is it? Very well, then. Were you, or were you not, an enemy of the late Colonel Menendez?" "I was." "What's that?" "I say I was. I hated him, and I hate him no less in death than I hated him living." I think that I had never seen a man so taken aback. Inspector Aylesbury, drawing out a large handkerchief, blew his nose. Replacing the handkerchief, he produced a notebook. "I am placing that statement on the record, sir," he said. He made an entry in the book, and then, "Where did you first meet Colonel Menendez?" he asked. "I never met him in my life." "What's that?" Colin Camber merely shrugged his shoulders. "I will repeat my question," said the inspector pompously. "Where did you first meet Colonel Juan Menendez?" "I have answered you, Inspector." "Oh, I see. You decline to answer that question. Very well, I will make a note of this." He did so. "And now," said he, "what were you doing at midnight last night?" "I was writing." "Where?" "Here." "What happened?" Very succinctly, Colin Camber repeated the statement which he had already made to Paul Harley, and, at its conclusion, "Send for the man Ah Tsong," directed Inspector Aylesbury. Colin Camber inclined his head, clapped his hands, and silently Ah Tsong entered. The inspector stared at him for several moments, as a visitor to the zoo might stare at some rare animal. Then, "Your name is Ah Tsong?" he began. "Ah Tsong," murmured the Chinaman. "I am going to ask you to give an exact account of your movements last night." "No sabby." Inspector Aylesbury cleared his throat. "I say, I wish to know exactly what you did last night. Answer me." Ah Tsong's face remained quite expressionless, and, "No sabby," he repeated. "Oh, I see," said the inspector. "This witness refuses to answer at all." "You are wrong," explained Colin Camber quietly. "Ah Tsong is a Chinaman, and his knowledge of English is very limited. He does not understand you." "He understood my first question. You can't draw wool over my eyes. He knows well enough. Are you going to answer me?" he demanded angrily of the Chinaman. "No sabby, master," he said, glancing aside at Colin Camber. "Number one in placey man gotchi no pigeon." Paul Harley was leisurely filling his pipe, and, "If you think the evidence of Ah Tsong important, Inspector," he said, "I will interpret if you wish." "You will what?" "I will act as interpreter." "Do you want me to believe that you speak Chinese?" "Your beliefs do not concern me, Inspector. I am merely offering my services." "Thanks," said the inspector dryly, "but I won't trouble you. I should like a few words with Mrs. Camber." "Very good." Colin Camber bent his head gravely and gave an order to Ah Tsong, who turned and went out. "And what firearms have you in this house?" asked Inspector Aylesbury. "An early Dutch arquebus, which you see in the corner," was the reply. "That doesn't interest me. I mean up-to-date weapons." "And a Colt revolver, which I have in a drawer here." As he spoke, Colin Camber opened a drawer in his desk and took out a heavy revolver of the American Army Service pattern. "I should like to examine it, if you please." Camber passed it to the inspector, and the latter, having satisfied himself that none of the chambers were loaded, peered down the barrel, and smelled at the weapon suspiciously. "If it has been recently used, it has been well cleaned," he said, and placed it on a cabinet beside him. "Anything else?" "Nothing." "No sporting rifles?" "None. I never shoot." "Oh, I see." The door opened, and Mrs. Camber came in. She was very simply dressed, and looked even more childlike than she had seemed before. I think Ah Tsong had warned her of the nature of the ordeal which she was to expect, but her wide-eyed timidity was nevertheless pathetic to witness. She glanced at me with a ghost of a smile, and, "Isola," said Colin Camber, inclining his head toward me in a grave gesture of courtesy, "Mr. Knox has generously forgiven me a breach of good manners for which I shall never forgive myself. I beg you to thank him as I have done." "It is so good of you," she said sweetly, and held out her hand. "But I knew you would understand that it was just a great mistake." "Mr. Paul Harley," Camber continued, "my wife welcomes you. And this, Isola, is Inspector Aylesbury, who desires a few moments' conversation upon a rather painful matter." I have heard," she whispered. "Ah Tsong told me." The pupils of her eyes dilated as she fixed an appealing glance upon the inspector. In justice to the latter, he was palpably abashed by the delicate beauty of the girl who stood before him, by her naivete, by that childishness of appearance and manner which must have awakened the latent chivalry in almost any man's heart. "I am sorry to have to trouble you with this disagreeable business, Mrs. Camber," he began, "but I believe you were awakened last night by the sound of a shot." "Yes," she replied, watching him intently. "That is so." "May I ask at what time this was heard?" "Ah Tsong told me it was after 12 o'clock." "Was the sound a loud one?" "Yes, it must have been to have awakened me." "I see. Do you think it was in the house?" "Oh, no." "In the garden?" "I really could not say, but I think it was farther away than that." "And what did you do?" "I rang the bell for Ah Tsong." "Did he come immediately?" "Almost immediately." "Was he dressed then?" "No, I don't think he was. He had quickly put on an overcoat. He usually answers at once, when I ring for him, you see." "I see. What did you do then?" "Well, I was frightened, you understand, and I told him to find out if all was well with my husband. He came back and told me that Cullen was writing. But the sound had alarmed me very much." "Oh, and now perhaps you will tell me, Mrs. Camber, when and where your husband first met Colonel Menendez." Every vestige of color fled from the girl's face. "So far as I know, they have never met," she replied haltingly. "Could you swear to that?" "Yes." I think that hitherto she had not fully realized the nature of the situation, but now something in the inspector's voice, or perhaps in our glances, told her the truth. She moved to where Colin Camber was sitting, looking down at him questioningly, pitifully. He put his arm around her and drew her close. Inspector Aylesbury cleared his throat and returned his notebook to his pocket. "I am going to take a look around the garden," he announced. My respect for him increased slightly, and Harley and I followed him out of the study. A police sergeant was sitting in the hall, and Ah Tsong was standing just outside the door. "Show me the way to the garden," directed the inspector. Ah Tsong stared stupidly, whereupon Paul Harley addressed him in his native language, rapidly and in a low voice, in order, as I divined, that the inspector should not hear him. "I feel dreadfully guilty, Knox," he confessed in a murmured aside. "For any Englishman, fictitious characters excepted, to possess a knowledge of Chinese is almost indecent." Presently, then, I found myself once more in that unkempt garden of which I retained such unpleasant memories. Inspector Aylesbury stared all about and up at the back of the house, humming to himself and generally behaving as though he were alone. Before the little summer study he stood still and— "Oh, I see," he muttered. What he had seen was painfully evident. The right-hand window, beneath which there was a permanent wooden seat, commanded an unobstructed view of the Tudor garden in the grounds of Cray's Folly. Clearly I could detect the speck of high-light upon the top of the sundial. The inspector stepped into the hut. It contained a bookshelf upon which a number of books remained, a table and a chair, with some few other dilapidated appointments. I glanced at Harley, who saw that he was staring as if hypnotized at the prospect in the valley below. I observed a constable on duty at the top of the steps which led down into the Tudor garden, but I could see nothing to account for Harley's fixed regard, until— "Pardon me one moment, Inspector," he muttered brusquely. Brushing past the indignant Aylesbury, who was examining the contents of the shelves in the hut, he knelt upon the wooden seat and stared intently through the open window. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, he chanted. "Good, that will settle it." "Oh, I see," said Inspector Aylesbury, standing strictly upright, his prominent eyes turned in the direction of the kneeling Harley. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on will settle it, eh? If you don't mind me saying so, it was settled already." "Yes," replied Harley, standing up, and I saw that his eyes were very bright, and that his face was slightly flushed. "You think the case is as simple as that?" "Simple!" exclaimed the inspector. "It is the most cunning thing that was ever planned, but I flatter myself that I have a good straight eye which can see a fairly long way." "Excellent," murmured Harley. "I congratulate you. Myopia is so common in the present generation. You have decided, of course, that the murder was committed by Ah Tsong." Inspector Aylesbury's eyes seemed to protrude extraordinarily. "Ah Tsong!" he exclaimed. "Ah Tsong!" "Surely it is palpable," continued Harley, "that of the 3 people residing in the guest-house, Ah Tsong is the only one who could possibly have done the deed." "Who could possibly? Who could possibly?" stuttered the inspector, then paused because of sheer lack of words. "Review the evidence," continued Harley coolly. "Mrs. Camber was awakened by the sound of a shot. She immediately rang for Ah Tsong. There was a short interval before Ah Tsong appeared, and when he did appear he was wearing an overcoat. Note this point, Inspector. Wearing an overcoat. He descended to the study and found Mr. Camber writing. Now, Ah Tsong sleeps in a room adjoining the kitchen on the ground floor. We passed his quarters on our way to the garden a moment ago. Of course you had noted this. Mr. Camber is therefore eliminated from our list of suspects." The inspector was growing very red, but ere he had time to speak, Harley continued. "The first of these 3 persons to have heard a shot fired at the end of the garden would have been Ah Tsong, and not Mrs. Camber, whose room is upstairs and in the front of the house. If it had been fired by Mr. Camber from the spot upon which we now stand, he would still have been in the garden at the moment when Mrs. Camber was ringing the bell for Ah Tsong. Mr. Camber must therefore have returned from the end of the garden to the study, and have passed Ah Tsong's room, unheard by the occupant, between the time the bell rang and the time that Ah Tsong went upstairs. This I submit to be impossible. There is an alternative. It is that he slipped in whilst Ah Tsong, standing on the landing above, was receiving his mistress's orders. I submit that the alternative is also impossible. We thus eliminate Mr. Camber from the case, as I have already mentioned." "Eliminate? Eliminate?" cried the inspector, beginning to recover power of speech. "Do you think you can fuddle me with a mass of words, Mr. Harley? Allow me to point out to you, sir, that you are in no way officially associated with this matter." "You have already drawn my attention to the fact, Inspector, but it can do no harm to jog my memory." Harley spoke entirely without bitterness, and I, who knew his every mood, realized that he was thoroughly enjoying himself. Therefore I knew that at last he had found a clue. "I may add, Inspector," said he, "that upon further reflection I have also eliminated Ah Tsong from the case. I forgot to mention that he lacks the first and second fingers of his right hand, and I have yet to meet the marksman who can shoot a man squarely between the eyes, by moonlight, at 100 yards, employing his third finger as trigger-finger. There are other points, but these will be sufficient to show you that this case is more complicated than you had assumed it to be." Inspector Aylesbury did not deign to reply, or could not trust himself to do so. He turned and made his way back to the house. Chapter 24. An Official Move. We re-entered the study to find Mrs. Camber sitting in a chair very close to her husband. Inspector Aylesbury stood in the open doorway for a moment, and then, stepping back into the hall, "Sergeant Butler," he said, addressing the man who waited there. "Yes, sir." "Go out to the gate and get Edson to relieve you. I shall want you to go back to headquarters in a few minutes." "Very good, sir." I scented what was coming, and as Inspector Aylesbury re-entered the room, "I should like to make a statement," announced Paul Harley quietly. The inspector frowned, and lowering his chin, regarded him with little favour. "I have not invited any statement from you, Mr. Harley," said he. "Quite," returned Harley. "I am volunteering it. It is this. I gather that you are about to take an important step officially. Having in view certain steps which I, also, am about to take, I would ask you to defer action, purely in your own interests, for at least 24 hours." "I hear you," said the inspector sarcastically. "Very well, Inspector. You have come newly into this case, and I assure you that its apparent simplicity is elusive. As new facts come into your possession, you will realize that what I say is perfectly true, and if you act now, you will be acting hastily. All that I have learned I am prepared to place at your disposal, but I predict that the interference of Scotland Yard will be necessary before this inquiry is concluded. Therefore, I suggest, since you have rejected my cooperation, that you obtain that of Detective Inspector Wessex, of the Criminal Investigation Department. In short, this is no one-man job. You will do yourself harm by jumping to conclusions, and cause unnecessary trouble to perfectly innocent people." "Is your statement concluded?" asked the inspector. "For the moment I have nothing to add." "Oh, I see. Very good. Then we can now get to business. Always with your permission, Mr. Harley." He took his stand before the fireplace, very erect, and invested with his most official manner. Mrs. Camber watched him in a way that was pathetic. Camber seemed to be quite composed, although his face was unusually pale. "Now, Mr. Camber," said the inspector, "I find your answers to the questions which I have put to you very unsatisfactory." "I am sorry," said Colin Camber quietly. "One moment, Inspector," interrupted Paul Harley. "You have not warned Mr. Camber." Thereupon the long-repressed wrath of Inspector Aylesbury burst forth. "Then I will warn you, sir," he shouted. "One more word, and you leave this house." "Yet I am going to venture on one more word," continued Harley, unperturbed. He turned to Colin Camber. "I happen to be a member of the bar, Mr. Camber," he said, "although I rarely accept a brief. Have I your authority to act for you?" "I am grateful, Mr. Harley, and I leave this unpleasant affair in your hands with every confidence." Camber stood up, bowing formally. The expression upon the inflamed face of Inspector Aylesbury was really indescribable, and, recognizing his mental limitations, I was almost tempted to feel sorry for him. However, he did not lack self-confidence, and— "I suppose you have scored, Mr. Harley," he said, a certain hoarseness perceptible in his voice. "But I know my duty, and I am not afraid to perform it. Now, Mr. Camber, did you, or did you not, at about 12 o'clock last night—" "Warn the accused," murmured Harley. Inspector Aylesbury uttered a choking sound, but— "I have to warn you," he said, "that your answers may be used as evidence. I will repeat. Did you, or did you not, at about 12 o'clock last night, shoot with intent to murder Colonel Juan Menendez?" Isola Camber leapt up, clutching at her husband's arm, as if to hold him back. "I did not," he replied quietly. "Nevertheless," continued the inspector, looking aggressively at Paul Harley whilst he spoke, "I am going to detain you pending further inquiries." Colin Camber inclined his head. "Very well," he said. "You only do your duty." The little fingers clutching his sleeve slowly relaxed, and Mrs. Camber, uttering a long sigh, sank in a swoon at his feet. "Isola! Isola!" he muttered. Stooping, he raised the childlike figure. "If you will kindly open the door, Mr. Knox," he said, "I will carry my wife to her room." I sprang to the door and held it widely open. Colin Camber, deadly pale, but holding his head very erect, walked in the direction of the hallway with his pathetic burden. Misreading the purpose written upon the stern white face, Inspector Aylesbury stepped forward. "Let someone else attend to Mrs. Camber," he cried sharply. "I wish you to remain here." His detaining hand was already upon Camber's shoulder when Harley's arm shot out like a barrier across the inspector's chest, and Colin Camber proceeded on his way. Momentarily he glanced aside, and I saw that his eyes were unnaturally bright. "Thank you, Mr. Harley," he said, and carried his wife from the room. Harley dropped his arm, and crossing, stood staring out of the window. Inspector Aylesbury ran heavily to the door. "Sergeant!" he called. "Sergeant! Keep that man in sight! He must return here immediately!" I heard the sound of heavy footsteps following Camber's up the stairs. Then Inspector Aylesbury turned, a bulky figure in the open doorway, and— "Now, Mr. Harley," said he, entering and reclosing the door, "you are a barrister, I understand. Very well, then. I suppose you are aware that you have resisted and obstructed an officer of the law in the execution of his duty." Paul Harley spun round upon his heel. "Is that a charge," he inquired, "or merely a warning?" The two glared at one another for a moment, then— "From now onward," continued the inspector, "I am going to have no more trouble with you, Mr. Harley. In the first place, I'll have you looked up in the law list. In the second place, I shall ask you to stick to your proper duties and leave me to look after mine." "I have endeavoured from the outset," replied Harley, his good humour quite restored, "to assist you in every way in my power. You have declined all my offers, and finally, upon the most flimsy evidence, you have detained a perfectly innocent man." "Oh, I see. A perfectly innocent man, eh?" "Perfectly innocent, Inspector. There are so many points that you have overlooked. For instance, do you seriously suppose that Mr. Camber had been waiting up here night after night on the off chance that Colonel Menendez would appear in the grounds of Cray's Folly?" "No, I don't. I have got that worked out." "Indeed. You interest me." "Mr. Camber has an accomplice at Cray's Folly." "What?" exclaimed Harley, and into his keen grey eyes crept a look of real interest. "He has an accomplice," repeated the inspector. "A certain witness was strangely reluctant to mention Mr. Camber's name. It was only after very keen examination that I got it at last. Now, Colonel Menendez had not retired last night, neither had a certain other party. That other party, sir, knows why Colonel Menendez was wandering about the garden at midnight." At first, I think, this astonishing innuendo did not fully penetrate to my mind, but when it did so, it seemed to galvanize me. Springing up from the chair in which I had been seated, "You preposterous fool!" I exclaimed hotly. It was the last straw. Inspector Aylesbury strode to the door, and throwing it open once more, turned to me. "Be good enough to leave the house, Mr. Knox," he said. "I am about to have it officially searched, and I will have no strangers present." I think I could have strangled him with pleasure, but even in my rage I was not foolhardy enough to lay myself open to that of which the inspector was quite capable at this moment. Without another word I walked out of the study, took my hat and stick, and opening the front door, quitted the guest-house, from which I had thus a second time been dismissed ignominiously. Appreciation of this fact, which came to me as I stepped into the porch, awakened my sense of humour, a gift truly divine which has saved many a man from desperation or worse. I felt like a schoolboy who had been turned out of a classroom, and I was glad that I could laugh at myself. A constable was standing in the porch, and he looked at me suspiciously. No doubt he perceived something very sardonic in my merriment. I walked out of the gate, before which a car was standing, and as I paused to light a cigarette I heard the door of the guest-house open and close. I glanced back, and there was Paul Harley coming to join me. "Now, Knox," he said briskly, "we have got our hands full." "My dear Harley, I am both angry and bewildered. Too angry and too bewildered to think clearly." "I can quite understand it. I should have become homicidal if I were forced to submit for long to the company of Inspector Aylesbury. Of course, I had anticipated the arrest of Colin Camber, and I fear there is worse to come." "What do you mean, Harley?" "I mean that failing the apprehension of the real murderer, I cannot see, at the moment, upon what the case for the defense is to rest." "But surely you demonstrated out there in the garden that he could not possibly have fired the shot." "Words, Knox, words. I could pick a dozen loopholes in my own argument. I had only hoped to defer the inevitable. I tell you, there is worse to come. 2 things we must do at once." "What are they?" "We must persuade the man on duty to allow us to examine the Tudor garden, and we must see the Chief Constable, whoever he may be, and prevail upon him to requisition the assistance of Scotland Yard. With Wessex in charge of the case, I might have a chance. Whilst this disastrous man Aylesbury holds the keys, there is none." "You heard about what he said about Miss Beverley?" We were now walking rapidly along the high road, and Harley nodded. "I did," he said. "I had expected it. He was inspired with this brilliant idea last night, and his ideas are too few to be lightly scrapped. If the Chief Constable is anything like the Inspector, what we are going to do, heaven only knows." "I take it, Harley, that you are convinced of Colin Camber's innocence." Harley did not answer for a moment, whereupon I glanced at him anxiously. Then, "Colin Camber," he replied, "is of so peculiar a type that I could not presume to say of what he is capable or is not capable. The most significant point in his favour is this: he is a man of unusual intellect. The planning of this cunning crime to such a man would have been child's play, Knox. But is it possible to believe that his genius would have failed him upon the most essential detail of all, namely, an alibi? It is not. Of course it is not. Which, continuing to regard Camber as an assassin, reduces us to the theory that the crime was committed in a moment of passion. This I maintain to be also impossible. It is no deed of impulse." "I agree with you. Now, I believe that the inquiry is going to turn upon a very delicate point. If I am wrong in this, then perhaps I am wrong in my whole conception of the case. But have you considered the mass of evidence against Colin Camber?" "I have, Harley," I replied sadly. "I have." "Think of all that we know, and which the Inspector does not know. Every single datum points in the same direction. No prosecution could ask for a more perfect case. Upon this fact I pin my hopes. Where an Aylesbury rushes in, I fear to tread." "The analogy with an angel was accidental, Knox," he added smilingly. "In other words, it is all too obvious. Yet I have failed once, Knox, failed disastrously, and it may be that, in my anxiety to justify myself, I am seeking for subtlety where no subtlety exists." End of Chapter 24. Part 9 of Batwing by Sax Rohmer. Read by Mark Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Batwing, Chapter 25. Aylesbury's Theory. There were strangers about Cray's Folly, and a sort of furtive activity, horribly suggestive. We had not pursued the circular route by the high road which would have brought us up to the lodge, but had turned aside where the swing gate opened upon a footpath into the meadows. It was the path which I had pursued upon the day of my visit to the Lavender Arms. A second private gate here gave access to the grounds at a point directly opposite the lake, and as we crossed the valley, making for the terraced lawns, I saw unfamiliar figures upon the veranda, and knew that the cumbersome processes of the law were already in motion. I was longing to speak to Val Beverley and to learn what had taken place during her interview with Inspector Aylesbury, but Harley led the way toward the tower wing, and, by a tortuous path through the rhododendrons, we finally came out on the northeast front and in sight of the Tudor garden. Harley crossed to the entrance, and was about to descend the steps, when the constable on duty there held out his arm. "Excuse me, sir," he said, "but I have orders to admit no one to this part of the garden." "Oh," said Harley, pulling up short. "but I am acting in this case. My name is Paul Harley." "Sorry, sir," replied the constable, "but you will have to see Inspector Aylesbury." My friend uttered an impatient exclamation, but, turning aside, "Very well, constable," he muttered. "I suppose I must submit. Our friend Aylesbury," he added to me as we walked away, "would appear to be a martinet as well as a walrus. At every step, Knox, he proves himself a tragic nuisance. This means waste of priceless time." "What had you hoped to do, Harley?" "Prove my theory," he returned, "but since every moment is precious, I must move in another direction." Manuel had just opened the doors to a sepulchral-looking person who proved to be the coroner's officer, and— "Manuel," cried Harley, "tell Carter to bring the car round at once." "Yes, sir." "I haven't time to fetch my own," he explained. "Where are you off to?" "I am off to see the chief constable, Knox. Aylesbury must be superseded at whatever cost. If the chief constable fails, I shall not hesitate to go higher. I will get along to the garage. I don't expect to be more than an hour. Meanwhile, do your best to act as a buffer between Aylesbury and the women. You understand me?" "Quite," I returned shortly. "But the task may prove no light one, Harley." "It won't," he assured me, smiling grimly. "How you must regret, Knox, that we didn't go fishing." With that he was off, eager-eyed and alert, the mood of dreamy abstraction dropped like a cloak discarded. He fully realized, as I did, that his unique reputation was at stake. I wondered, as I had wondered at the guest-house, whether in undertaking to clear Colin Camber he had acted upon sheer conviction, or, embittered by the death of his client, had taken a gambler's chance. It was unlike him to do so. But now, beyond reach of that charm of manner which Colin Camber possessed, and discounting the pathetic sweetness of his girl-wife, I realized how black was the evidence against him. Occupied with these, and even more troubled thoughts, I was making my way toward the library, undetermined how to act, when I saw Val Beverley coming along the corridor which communicated with Madame de Stemmer's room. I had a welcome in her eyes which made my heart beat the faster. "Oh, Mr. Knox," she cried, "I am so glad you have returned. Tell me all that has happened, for I feel in some way that I am responsible for it." I nodded gravely. "You know, then, where Inspector Aylesbury went when he left here, after his interview with you?" She looked at me pathetically. "He went to the guest-house, of course." "Yes," I said, "he was close behind us." "And," she hesitated, "Mr. Camber?" "He has been detained." "Oh," she moaned, "I could hate myself. Yet what could I say? What could I do?" "Just tell me all about it," I urged. "What were the inspector's questions?" "Well," explained the girl, "he had evidently learned from someone, presumably one of the servants, that there was enmity between Mr. Camber and Colonel Menendez. He asked me if I knew of this, and of course I had to admit that I did. But when I told him that I had no idea of its cause, he did not seem to believe me." "No," I murmured. "Any evidence which fails to dovetail with his preconceived theories he puts down as a lie." "He seemed to have made up his mind for some reason," she continued, "that I was intimately acquainted with Mr. Camber, whereas, of course, I have never spoken to him in my life, although whenever he has passed me in the road he has always saluted me with quite delightful courtesy. Oh, Mr. Knox, it is horrible to think of this great misfortune coming to those poor people." She looked at me pleadingly. "How did his wife take it?" "Poor little girl," I replied. "It was an awful blow." "I feel that I want to set out this very minute," declared Val Beverley, "and go to her, and try to comfort her, because I feel in my very soul that her husband is innocent. She is such a sweet little thing. I have wanted to speak to her since the very first time I ever saw her, but on the rare occasions that we have met in the village she has hurried past as though she were afraid of me. Mr. Harley surely knows that her husband is not guilty." "I think she does," I replied, "but he may have great difficulty in proving it. And what else did Inspector Aylesbury wish to know?" "How can I tell you?" she said in a low voice, and biting her lip agitatedly, she turned her head aside. "Perhaps I can guess." "Can you?" she asked, looking at me quickly. "Well, then, he seemed to attach a ridiculous importance to the fact that I had not retired last night at the time of the tragedy." "I know," said I grimly, another preconceived idea of his. I told him the truth of the matter, which is surely quite simple, and at first I was unable to understand the nature of his suspicions. Then, after a time, his questions enlightened me. He finally suggested, quite openly, that I had not come down from my room to the corridor in which Madame de Stamer was lying, but had actually been there at the time. "In the corridor outside her room?" "Yes. He seemed to think that I had just come in from the door near the end of the east wing and beside the tower, which opens into the shrubbery." "That you had just come in?" I exclaimed. "He thinks, then, that you had been out in the grounds?" Val Beverley's face had been very pale, but now she flushed indignantly and glanced away from me as she replied. "He dared to suggest that I had been to keep an assignation." "The fool!" I cried. "The ignorant, impudent fool!" "Oh," she declared, "I felt quite ill with indignation. I am afraid I may regard Inspector Aylesbury as an enemy from now onward, for when I had recovered from the shock I told him very plainly what I thought about his intellect, or lack of it." "I'm glad you did," I said warmly. "Before Inspector Aylesbury is through with this business, I fancy he will know more about his limitations than he knows at present. The fact of the matter is that he is badly out of his depth, but is not man enough to acknowledge the fact even to himself." She smiled at me pathetically. "Whatever should I have done if I had been alone?" she said. I was tempted to direct the conversation into a purely personal channel, but common sense prevailed, and "Is Madame de Stamer awake?" I asked. "Yes," the girl nodded. "Dr. Rolleston is with her now." "And does she know?" "Yes. She sent for me directly she awoke, and asked me." "And you told her?" "How could I do otherwise? She was quite composed, wonderfully composed, and the way she heard the news was simply heroic. But here is Dr. Rolleston coming now." I glanced along the corridor, and there was the physician approaching briskly. "Good morning, Mr. Knox," he said. "Good morning, Doctor. I hear that your patient is much improved." "Wonderfully so," he answered. "She has enough courage for 10 men. She wishes to see you, Mr. Knox, and to hear your account of the tragedy." "Do you think it would be wise?" "I think it would be best." "Do you hold any hope of her permanently recovering the use of her limbs?" Dr. Rolleston shook his head doubtfully. "It may have only been temporary," he replied. "These obscure nervous affections are very fickle. It is unsafe to make predictions. But mentally, at least, she is quite restored from the effects of last night's shock. You need to apprehend no hysteria or anything of that nature, Mr. Knox." "Oh, I see!" exclaimed a loud voice behind us. We all three turned, and there was Inspector Aylesbury crossing the hall in our direction. "Good morning, Dr. Rolleston," he said, deliberately ignoring my presence. "I hear that your patient is quite well again this morning." "She is much improved," returned the physician dryly. "Then I can get her testimony. Which is most important to my case?" "She is somewhat better. If she cares to see you, I do not forbid the interview." "Oh, that's good of you, Doctor." He bowed to Miss Beverley. "Perhaps, miss, you would ask Madame de Stamer to see me for a few minutes." Val Beverley looked at me appealingly, then shrugged her shoulders, turned aside, and walked in the direction of Madame de Stamer's door. "Well," said Dr. Rolleston, in his brisk way, shaking me by the hand, "I must be getting along. Good morning, Mr. Cox. Good morning, Inspector Aylesbury." He walked rapidly out to his waiting car. The presence of Inspector Aylesbury exercised upon Dr. Rolleston a similar effect to that which a red rag has upon a bull. As he took his departure, the inspector drew out his pocket-book, and, humming gently to himself, began to consult certain entries therein, with a portentous air of reflection which would have been funny if it had not been so irritating. Thus we stood when Val Beverley returned, and "Madame de Stamer will see you, Inspector Aylesbury," she said, "but wishes Mr. Knox to be present at the interview." "Oh," said the inspector, lowering his chin. "I see. Oh, very well." Chapter 26. In Madame's Room. Madame de Stamer's apartment was a large and elegant one. From the window drapings, which were of some light, figured, satiny material, to the bed-cover, the lamp-shades, and the carpet, it was French. Faintly perfumed, and decorated with many bowls of roses, it reflected in its ornaments, its pictures, its slender-legged furniture, the personality of the occupant. In a large high bed, reclining amidst a number of silken pillows, lay Madame de Stamer. The theme of the room was violet and silver, and to this everything conformed. The toilet service was of dull silver and violet enamel. The mirrors and some of the pictures had dull silver frames, and there was nothing tawdry or glittering. The bed itself, which I thought resembled a bed of state, was of the same dull silver, with a coverlet of delicate violet hue. But Madame's décolleté robe was trimmed with white fur, so that her hair, dressed high upon her head, seemed to be of silver too. Reclining there upon her pillows, she looked like some grande dame of that France which was swept away by the Revolution. Immediately above the dressing-table I observed a large portrait of Colonel Menendez, dressed as I had imagined he should be dressed when I had first set eyes on him, in tropical riding-kit, and holding a broad-brimmed hat in his hand. A strikingly handsome, arrogant figure he made, uncannily like the Velasquez in the library. At the face of Madame de Stamer I looked long and searchingly. She had not neglected the art of the toilet. Blinds tempered the sunlight which flooded her room, but that, failing the service of rouge, Madame had been pale this morning, I perceived immediately. In some subtle way the night had changed her. Something was gone out of her face, and something come into it. I thought, and lived to remember the thought, that it was thus Marie Antoinette might have looked when they told her how the drums had rolled in the Place de la Révolution on that morning of the 21st of January. "Oh, Monsieur Knox," she said sadly, "you are there, I see. Come and sit here beside me, my friend. Val, dear, remain. Is this Inspector Aylesbury who wishes to speak to me?" The inspector, who had entered with all the confidence in the world, seemed to lose some of it in the presence of this grand lady, who was so little impressed by the dignity of his office. She waved one slender hand in the direction of a violet brocaded chair. "Sit down, Monsieur l'Inspecteur," she commanded, for it was rather a command than an invitation. Inspector Aylesbury cleared his throat and sat down. "Ah, Monsieur Knox," exclaimed Madame, turning to me with one of her rapid movements, "is your friend afraid to face me then? Does he think that he has failed? Does he think that I condemn him?" "He knows that he has failed, Madame de Stamer," I replied, "but his absence is due to the fact that at this hour he is hot upon the trail of the assassin." "What?" she exclaimed. "What?" and bending forward touched my arm. "Tell me again! Tell me again!" "He is following a clue, Madame de Stamer, which he hopes will lead to the truth." "Ah, if I could believe it would lead to the truth," she said. "If I dared to believe this." "Why should it not?" She shook her head, smiling with such a resigned sadness that I averted my gaze and glanced across at Val Beverley, who was seated on the opposite side of the bed. "If you knew, if you knew—" I looked again into the tragic face, and realized that this was an older woman than the brilliant hostess I had known. She sighed, shrugged, and— "Tell me, Monsieur Knox," she continued, "it was swift and merciful, eh?" "Instantaneous," I replied in a low voice. "A good shot?" she asked, strangely. "A wonderful shot," I answered, thinking that she imposed unnecessary torture upon herself. "They say he must be taken away, Monsieur Knox, but I reply, not until I have seen him." "Madame," began Val Beverley gently. "Ah, my dear," Madame de Stamer, without looking at the speaker, extended one hand in her direction, the fingers characteristically curled. "You do not know me. Perhaps it is a good job. You are a man, Mr. Knox, and men, especially men who write, know more of women than they know of themselves, is it not so? You will understand that I must see him again." "Madame de Stamer," I said, "your courage is almost terrible." She shrugged her shoulders. "I am not proud to be brave, my friend. The animals are brave, but many cowards are proud. Listen again. He suffered no pain, you think?" "None, Madame de Stamer." "So Dr. Rolleston assures me. He died in his sleep. You do not think he was awake, eh?" "Most certainly he was not awake." "It is the best way to die," she said simply. "Yet he, who was brave and who had faced death many times, would have counted it." She snapped her white fingers, glancing across the room to where Inspector Aylesbury, very subdued, sat upon the brocaded chair twirling his cap between his hands. "And now, Inspector Aylesbury," she asked, "what is it you wish me to tell you?" "Well, madame," began the inspector, and stood up, evidently in an endeavour to recover his dignity, but— "Sit down, Mr. Inspector. I beg of you to be seated," cried Madame. "I will not be questioned by one who stands, and if you were to walk about, I should shriek." He resumed his seat, clearing his throat nervously. "Very well, madame," he continued. "I have come to you particularly for information respecting a certain Mr. Camber." "Oh, yes," said Madame. Her vibrant voice was very low. "You know him, no doubt?" "I have never met him." "What!" exclaimed the inspector. Madame shrugged, and glanced at me eloquently. "Well," he continued, "this gets more and more funny. I am told by Pedro, the butler, that Colonel Menendez looked upon Mr. Camber as an enemy, and Miss Beverley here admitted that it was true. Yet, although he was an enemy, nobody ever seems to have spoken to him, and he swears that he had never spoken to Colonel Menendez." "Yes?" said Madame listlessly. "Is that so?" "It is so, madame. And now you tell me that you have never met him." "I did tell you so, yes." "His wife, then?" "I never met his wife," said Madame rapidly. "But it is a fact that Colonel Menendez regarded him as an enemy." "It is a fact, yes." "And now we are coming to it. What was the cause of this?" "I cannot tell you." "Do you mean that you don't know?" "I mean that I cannot tell you." "Oh," said the inspector blankly. "I see. That's not helping me very much, is it?" "No, it is no help," said Madame, twirling a ring upon her finger. The inspector cleared his throat again, then— "There had been other attempts, I believe, at assassination?" he asked. Madame nodded. "Several." "Did you witness any of these?" "None of them." "But you know that they took place?" "Juan, Colonel Menendez, had told me so." "And he suspected that there was someone lurking about his house?" "Yes." "Also someone broke in?" "There were doors unfastened, and a great disturbance, so I suppose someone must have done so." I wondered if he would refer to the bat-wing nailed to the door, but he had evidently decided that this clue was without importance, nor did he once refer to the aspect of the case which concerned voodoo. He possessed a sort of mulish obstinacy, and was evidently determined to use no scrap of information which he had obtained from Paul Harley. "Now, madame," said he, "you heard the shot fired last night?" "I did." "It woke you up?" "I was already awake." "Oh, I see. You were awake."
"I was awake."
"Where did you think the sound came from?"
"From back yonder, beyond the east wing."
"Beyond the east wing," muttered Inspector Aylesbury. "Now, let me see." He turned ponderously in his chair, gazing out of the windows. "We look out on the south here. You say the sound of the shot came from the east?"
"So it seemed to me."
"Oh." This piece of information seemed badly to puzzle him. "And what then?"
"I was so startled that I ran to the door before I remembered that I could not walk."
She glanced aside at me with a tired smile, and laid her hand upon my arm in an oddly caressing way, as if to say, "He is so stupid. I should not have expressed myself in that way." Truly enough, the inspector misunderstood, for "I don't follow what you mean, madame," he declared. "You say you forgot that you could not walk?"
"No, no, I expressed myself wrongly," Madame replied in a weary voice. "The fright, the terror, gave me strength to stagger to the door, and there I fell and swooned."
"Oh, I see. You speak of fright and terror. Were these caused by the sound of the shot?"
"For some reason my cousin believed himself to be in peril," explained Madame. "He went in dread of assassination, you understand. Very well, he caused me to feel this dread also. When I heard the shot, something told me that—" She paused, and suddenly placing her hands before her face, added in a whisper, "that it had come."
Val Beverley was watching Madame de Stamer anxiously, and the fact that she was unfit to undergo further examination was so obvious that any other than an Inspector Aylesbury would have withdrawn. The latter, however, seemed now to be glued to his chair, and "Oh, I see," he said. "And now there's another point. Have you any idea what took Colonel Menendez out into the grounds last night?" Madame de Stamer lowered her hands and gazed across at the speaker.
"What is that, Monsieur l'Inspecteur?"
"Well, you don't think he might have gone out to talk to someone?"
"To someone? To what one?"
demanded Madame scornfully. "Well, it isn't natural for a man to go walking about in the garden at midnight when he's unwell, is it? Not alone. But if there was a lady in the case, he might go."
"A lady?"
said Madame softly.
"Yes, continue."
"Well," resumed the inspector, deceived by the soft voice, "the young lady sitting beside you was still wearing her evening dress when I arrived here last night. I found that out, although she didn't give me a chance to see her." His words had an effect more dramatic than he could have foreseen. Madame de Stamer threw her arm around Val Beverley and hugged her so closely to her side that the girl's curly-brown head was pressed against Madame's shoulder. Thus holding her, she sat rigidly upright, her strange, still eyes glaring across the room at Inspector Aylesbury. Her whole pose was instinct with challenge, with defiance, and in that moment I identified the elusive memory which the eyes of Madame so often had conjured up in my mind. Once, years before, I had seen a wounded tigress standing over her cubs, a beautiful, fearless creature, blazing defiance with dying eyes upon those who had destroyed her, the mother instinct supreme to the last. For as she fell, to rise no more, she had thrown her paw round the cowering cubs. It was not in shape, nor in color, but in expression and in their stillness, that the eyes of Madame de Stamer resembled the eyes of the tigress. "Oh, Madame, Madame," moaned the girl, "how dare he!" "Ah!" Madame de Stamer raised her head yet higher, a royal gesture, that unmoving stare set upon the face of the discomfited Inspector Aylesbury. "Leave my apartment!" Her left hand shot out dramatically in the direction of the door, but even yet the fingers remained curled. "Stupid, gross fool!" Inspector Aylesbury stood up, his face very flushed. "I am only doing my duty, madame," he said. "Go, go," commanded madame. "I insist that you go." Convulsively she held Val Beverley to her side, and although I could not see the girl's face, I knew that she was weeping. Those implacable flaming eyes followed with their stare the figure of the inspector right to the doorway, for he essayed no further speech, but retired. I also rose, and "Madame de Stamer," I said, speaking, I fear, very unnaturally, "I love your spirit." She threw back her head, smiling up at me. I shall never forget that look, nor shall I attempt to portray all which it conveyed, for I know I should fail. "My friend," she said, and extended her hand to be kissed. Chapter 27. An Inspiration. Inspector Aylesbury had disappeared when I came out of the hall, but Pedro was standing there to remind me of the fact that I had not breakfasted. I realized that despite all tragic happenings I was ravenously hungry, and accordingly I agreed to his proposal that I should take breakfast on the south veranda, as on the previous morning. To the south veranda, accordingly, I made my way, rather despising myself because I was capable of hunger at such a time and amidst such horrors. The daily papers were on my table, for Carter drove into Market Hilton every morning to meet the London train which brought them down, but I did not open any of them. Pedro waited upon me in person. I could see that the man was pathetically anxious to talk. Accordingly, when he presently brought me a fresh supply of hot rolls, "This has been a dreadful blow to you, Pedro," I said. "Dreadful, sir," he returned. "Fearful. I lose a splendid master. I lose my place, and I am far, far from home." "You are from Cuba?" "Yes, yes. I was with Senor the Colonel Don Juan in Cuba." "And do you know anything of the previous attempts which had been made upon his life, Pedro?" "Nothing, sir. Nothing at all." "But the Batwing, Pedro?" He looked at me in a startled way. "Yes, sir," he replied. "I found it pinned to the door here." "And what did you think it meant?" "I thought it was a joke, sir. Not a nice joke, by someone who knew Cuba." "You know the meaning of Batwing, then?" "It is Obeah. I have never seen it before, but I have heard of it." "And what did you think?" said I, proceeding with my breakfast. "I thought it was meant to frighten." "But who did you think had done it?" "I had heard Senor Don Juan say that Mr. Camber hated him, so I thought perhaps he had sent someone to do it." "But why should Mr. Camber have hated the Colonel?" "I cannot say, sir. I wish I could tell." "Was your master popular in the West Indies?" I asked. "Well, sir—" Pedro hesitated. "Perhaps not so well liked." "No," I said. "I had gathered as much." The man withdrew, and I continued my solitary meal, listening to the song of the skylarks, and thinking how complex was human existence compared with any other form of life beneath the sun. How to employ my time until Harley should return I knew not. Common delicacy dictated an avoidance of Val Beverley until she should have recovered from the effect of Inspector Aylesbury's gross insinuations, and I was curiously disinclined to become involved in the gloomy formalities which ensue upon a crime of violence. Nevertheless, I felt compelled to remain within call, realizing that there might be unpleasant duties which Pedro could not perform, and which must therefore devolve upon Val Beverley. I lighted my pipe and walked out onto the sloping lawn. A gardener was at work with a big syringe, destroying a patch of weeds which had appeared in one corner of the velvet turf. He looked up in a sort of startled way as I passed, bidding me good morning, and then resuming his task. I thought that this man's activities were symbolic of the way of the world, in whose eternal progression one poor human life counts as nothing. Presently I came in sight of that door which opened into the rhododendron shrubbery, the door by which Colonel Menendez had come out to meet his death. His bedroom was directly above, and as I picked my way through the closely growing bushes, which at an earlier time I had thought to be impassable, I paused in the very shadow of the tower, and glanced back and upward. I could see the windows of the little smoke-room in which we had held our last interview with Menendez, and I thought of the shadow which Harley had seen upon the blind. I was unable to disguise from myself the fact that when Inspector Aylesbury should learn of this occurrence, as presently he must do, it would give new vigour to his ridiculous and unpleasant suspicions. I passed on, and, considering the matter impartially, found myself faced by the questions, who was the shadow which Harley had seen upon the blind, and with what purpose did Colonel Menendez leave the house at midnight? Somnambulism might solve the second riddle, but to the first I could find no answer acceptable to my reason. And now, pursuing my aimless way, I presently came in sight of a gable of the guest-house. I could obtain a glimpse of the hut which had once been Cullen Camber's workroom. The window, through which Paul Harley had stared so intently, possessed sliding panes. These were closed, and a ray of sunlight striking upon the glass produced, because of an over-leaning branch which crossed the top of the window, an effect like that of a giant eye glittering evilly through the trees. I could see a constable moving about in the garden. Ever and anon the sun shone upon the buttons of his tunic. By such steps my thoughts led me on to the pathetic figure of Isola Camber. Save for the faithful Ah Tsong, she was alone in that house to which tragedy had come unbidden, unforeseen. I doubted if she had a woman friend in all the countryside. Doubtless, I reflected, the old housekeeper to whom she had referred would return as speedily as possible, but pending the arrival of someone to whom she could confide all her sorrows, I found it almost impossible to contemplate the loneliness of the tragic little figure. Such was my mental state, and my thoughts were all of compassion, when suddenly, like a lurid light, an inspiration came to me. I had passed out from the shadow of the tower, and was walking in the direction of the sentinel yews, when this idea, dreadfully complete, leapt to my mind. I pulled up short, as though hindered by a palpable barrier. Vague musings, evanescent theories, vanished like smoke, and a ghastly, consistent theory of the crime unrolled itself before me, with all the cold logic of truth. "My God!" I groaned aloud. "I see it all! I see it all!" End of chapter 27. Part 10 of Batwing by Sax Rohmer. Read by Mark Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Batwing, Chapter 28. My Theory of the Crime. The afternoon was well advanced before Paul Harley returned. So deep was my conviction that I had hit upon the truth, and so well did my theory stand every test which I could apply to it, that I felt disinclined for conversation with anyone concerned in the tragedy until I should have submitted the matter to the keen analysis of Harley. Upon the sorrow of Madame de Stamer I naturally did not intrude, nor did I seek to learn if she had carried out her project of looking upon the dead man. About midday the body was removed, after which an oppressive and awesome stillness seemed to descend upon Cray's Folly. Inspector Aylesbury had not returned from his investigations at the guest-house, and, learning that Miss Beverley was remaining with Madame de Stamer, I declined to face the ordeal of a solitary luncheon in the dining-room, and merely ate a few sandwiches, walking over to the Lavender Arms for a glass of Mrs. Wooten's excellent ale. Here I found the bar-parlour full of local customers, and although a heated discussion was in progress as I opened the door, silence fell upon my appearance. Mrs. Wooten greeted me sadly.
"Ah, sir," she said, as she placed a mug before me. "Of course you've heard." "I have, madam," I replied, perceiving that she did not know me to be a guest at Cray's Folly. "Well, well," she shook her head. "It had to come, with all these foreign folk about." She retired to some sanctum at the rear of the bar, and I drank my beer amid one of those silences which sometimes descend upon such a gathering when a stranger appears in its midst. Not until I moved to depart was this silence broken. Then, "Ah, well," said an old fellow, evidently a farm-hand, "we know now why he was priming hisself with the drink, we do." "Aye," came a growling chorus. I came out of the Lavender Arms full of a knowledge that so far as Mid-Hatton was concerned, Colin Camber was already found guilty. I had hoped to see something of Val Beverley on my return, but she remained closeted with Madame de Stamer, and I was left in loneliness to pursue my own reflections, and to perfect that theory which had presented itself to my mind. In Harley's absence, I had taken it upon myself to give an order to Pedro to the effect that no reporters were to be admitted, and in this I had done well. So quickly does evil news fly that, between midday and the hour of Harley's return, no fewer than 5 reporters, I believe, presented themselves at Cray's Folly. Some of the more persistent continued to haunt the neighbourhood, and I had withdrawn to the deserted library in order to avoid observation, when I heard a car draw up in the courtyard, and a moment later heard Harley asking for me. I hurried out to meet him, and as I appeared at the door of the library, "Hello, Knox," he called, running up the steps. "Any developments?" "No actual development," I replied, "except that several members of the press have been here." "You told them nothing?" he asked eagerly. "No, they were not admitted." "Good, good," he muttered. "I had expected you long before this, Harley." "Naturally," he said, with a sort of irritation. "I have been all the way to Whitehall and back." "To Whitehall? What, have you been to London?" "I had half anticipated it, Knox. The Chief Constable, although quite a decent fellow, is a stickler for routine. On the strength of those facts which I thought fit to place before him, he could see no reason for superseding Aylesbury. Accordingly, without further waste of time, I headed straight for Whitehall. You may remember a somewhat elaborate report which I completed upon the eve of our departure from Chancery Lane?" I nodded. "A very thankless job for the Home Office, Knox, but I received my reward today. Inspector Wessex had been placed in charge of the case, and I hope he will be down here within the hour. Pending his arrival, I am tied hand and foot." We had walked into the library, and stopping suddenly, Harley stared me very hard in the face. "You are bottling something up, Knox," he declared. "Out with it. Has Aylesbury distinguished himself again?" "No," I replied. "On the contrary. He interviewed Madame de Stamer, and came out with a flea in his ear." "Good," said Harley, smiling. "A clever woman, and a woman of spirit, Knox." "You are right," I replied. "And you are also right in supposing that I have a communication to make to you." "Ah, I thought so. What is it?" "It is a theory, Harley, which appears to me to cover the facts of the case." "Indeed," said he, continuing to stare at me. "And what inspired it?" "I was staring up at the window of the smoke-room today, and I remembered the shadow which you had seen upon the blind." "Yes," he cried eagerly. "And does your theory explain that too?" "It does, Harley." "Then I am all anxiety to hear it." "Very well, then. I will endeavour to be brief. Do you recollect Miss Beverley's story of the unfamiliar footsteps which passed her door on several occasions?" "Perfectly." "You recollect that you yourself heard someone crossing the hall, and that both of us heard a door close?" "We did." "And finally, you saw the shadow of a woman upon the blind of the Colonel's private study. Very well. Excluding the preposterous theory of Inspector Aylesbury, there is no woman in Cray's Folly whose footsteps could possibly have been heard in that corridor, and whose shadow could possibly have been seen upon the blind of Colonel Menendez's room." "I agree," said Harley quietly.
I have definitely eliminated all the servants from the case. Therefore, proceed, Knox. I am all attention." "I will do so. There is a door on the south side of the house, close to the tower, and opening into the rhododendron shrubbery. This was the door used by Colonel Menendez in his somnambulistic rambles, according to his own account. Now, assuming his statement to have been untrue in one particular, that is, assuming he was not walking in his sleep, but was fully awake—" "Eh?" exclaimed Harley, his expression undergoing a subtle change. "Do you think his statement was untrue?" "According to my theory, Harley, his statement was untrue, in this particular at least. But to proceed. Might he not have employed this door to admit a nocturnal visitor?" "It is feasible," muttered Harley, watching me closely. "For the Colonel to descend to this side door when the household was sleeping," I continued, "and to admit a woman secretly to Cray's Folly, would have been a simple matter. Indeed, on the occasions of these visits, he might have even unbolted the door himself after Pedro had bolted it, in order to enable her to enter without his descending for the purpose of admitting her." "By heavens, Knox," said Harley, "I believe you have it." His eyes were gleaming excitedly, and I proceeded. "Hence the footsteps which passed Miss Beverley's door, hence the shadow which you saw upon the blind, and the sounds which you detected in the hall were caused, of course, by this woman retiring. It was the door leading into the shrubbery which we heard being closed." "Continue," said Harley, "although I can plainly see to what this is leading." "You can see, Harley?" I cried. "Of course you can see. The enmity between Camber and Menendez is understandable, at least." "You mean that Menendez was Mrs. Camber's lover? Don't you agree with me?" "It is feasible, Knox, dreadfully feasible. But go on." "My theory also explains Cullen Camber's lapse from sobriety. It is legitimate to suppose that his wife, who is a Cuban, had been intimate with Menendez before meeting with Camber. Perhaps she had broken the tie at the time of her marriage, but this is mere supposition. Then her old lover, his infatuation by no means abated, leases the property adjoining that of his successful rival." "Knox!" exclaimed Paul Harley, "this is brilliant. I am all impatience for the denouement." "It is coming," I said triumphantly. "Relations are re-established, clandestinely. Cullen Camber learns of these. A passionate quarrel ensues, resulting in a long drinking bout designed to drown his sorrows. His love for his wife is so great that he has forgiven her this infidelity. Accordingly, she has promised to see her lover no more. Hers was the figure which you saw outlined upon the blind on the night before the tragedy, Harley. The gestures, which you described as those of despair, furnish evidence to confirm my theory. It was a final meeting." Muttered Harley. "It would be taking big chances, because we have to suppose, Knox, that these visits to Cray's Folly were made whilst her husband was at work in the study. If he had suddenly decided to turn in, all would have been discovered." "True," I agreed, "but is it impossible?" "No, not a bit. Women are dreadful gamblers. But continue, Knox." "Very well. Colonel Menendez has refused to accept his dismissal, and Mrs. Camber had been compelled to promise, without necessarily intending to carry out the promise, that she would see him again on the following night. She failed to come, whereupon he, growing impatient, walked out into the grounds of Cray's Folly to look for her. She may have even intended to come, and have been intercepted by her husband. But in any event, the latter, seeing the man who had wronged him, standing out there in the moonlight, found temptation to be too strong. On the whole, I favor the idea that he had intercepted his wife, and, snatching up a rifle, had actually gone out into the garden with the intention of shooting Menendez." "I see," murmured Harley in a low voice. "This hypothesis, Knox, does not embrace the Batwing episodes." "If Menendez has lied upon one point," I returned, "it is permissible to suppose that his entire story was merely a tissue of falsehood." "I see. But why did he bring me to Cray's Folly? "Don't you understand, Harley?" I cried excitedly. "He really feared for his life, since he knew that Camber had discovered the intrigue." Paul Harley heaved a long sigh. "I must congratulate you, Knox," he said gravely, "upon a really splendid contribution to my case. In several particulars I find myself nearer to the truth. But the definite establishment or shattering of your theory rests upon one thing." "What's that?" I asked. "You are surely not thinking of the batwing nailed upon the door?" "Not at all," he replied. "I am thinking of the 7th yew tree from the northeast corner of the Tudor garden." Chapter 29. A Lee-Enfield Rifle. What reply I should have offered to this astonishing remark I cannot say, but at that moment the library door burst open unceremoniously, and outlined against the warmly illuminated hall, where sunlight poured down through the dome, I beheld the figure of Inspector Aylesbury. "Ah!" he cried loudly. "So you have come back, Mr. Harley. I thought you had thrown up the case." "Did you?" said Harley smilingly. "No, I am still persevering in my ineffectual way." "Oh, I see. And have you quite convinced yourself that Colin Camber is innocent?" "In one or two particulars my evidence remains incomplete." "Oh, in one or two particulars, eh? But generally speaking, you don't doubt his innocence?" "I don't doubt it for a moment." Harley's words surprised me. I recognized, of course, that he might merely be bluffing the inspector, but it was totally alien to his character to score a rhetorical success at the expense of what he knew to be the truth. And so sure was I of the accuracy of my deductions that I no longer doubted Colin Camber to be the guilty man. "At any rate," continued the inspector, "he is in detention, and likely to remain there. If you are going to defend him at the assizes, I don't envy you your job, Mr. Harley." He was blatantly triumphant, so that the fact was evident enough that he had obtained some further piece of evidence which he regarded as conclusive. "I have detained the man Ah Tsong as well," he went on. "He was an accomplice of your innocent friend, Mr. Harley." "Was he really?" murmured Harley. "Finally," continued the inspector, "I have only to satisfy myself regarding the person who lured Colonel Menendez out into the grounds last night to have my case complete." I turned aside, unable to trust myself, but Harley remarked quite coolly, "Your industry is admirable, Inspector Aylesbury, but I seem to perceive that you have made a very important discovery of some kind." "Ah, you have got wind of it, have you?" "I have no information on the point," replied Harley, "but your manner urges me to suggest that perhaps success has crowned your efforts." "It has," replied the inspector. "I am a man that doesn't do things by halves. I didn't content myself with just staring out of the window of that little hut in the grounds of the guest-house like you did, Mr. Harley, and saying twice one are two. I looked at every book on the shelves, and at every page of those books." "You must have materially added to your information." "Ah, very likely. But my inquiries didn't stop there. I had the floor up." "The floor of the hut?" "The floor of the hut, sir. The planks were quite loose. I had satisfied myself that it was a likely hiding-place." "What did you find there? A dead rat?" Inspector Aylesbury turned and— "Sergeant Butler," he called. The sergeant came forward from the hall, carrying a cricket-bag. This Inspector Aylesbury took from him, placing it upon the floor of the library at his feet. "Now, sir," said he, "I borrowed this bag in which to bring the evidence away, the hanging evidence which I discovered beneath the floor of the hut." I had turned again when the man had referred to his discovery, and now, glancing at Harley, I saw that his face had grown suddenly very stern. "Show me your evidence, Inspector," he asked shortly. "There can be no objection," returned the inspector. Opening the bag, he took out a rifle. Paul Harley's hands were thrust in his coat pockets. By the movement of the cloth I could see that he had clenched his fists. Here was confirmation of my theory. "A service rifle," said the inspector triumphantly, holding up the weapon. "A Lee Enfield charger-loader. It contains 4 cartridges, 3 undischarged and 1 discharged. He had not even troubled to eject it." The inspector dropped the weapon into the bag with a dramatic movement. "Fancy theories about bat wings and voodoos," he said scornfully, "may satisfy you, Mr. Harley, but I think this rifle will prove more satisfactory to the coroner." He picked up the bag and walked out of the library. Harley stood posed in a curiously rigid way, looking after him. Even when the door had closed, he did not change his position at once. Then, turning slowly, he walked to an armchair and sat down. "Harley," I said hesitatingly, "has this discovery surprised you?" "Surprised me?" he returned in a low voice. "It has appalled me." "Then, although you seem to regard my theory as sound," I continued rather resentfully, "all the time you continue to believe Colin Camber to be innocent?" "I believe it so still." "What?" "I thought we had determined, Knox," he said wearily, "that a man of Camber's genius, having decided upon murder, must have arranged for an unassailable alibi. Very well. Are we now to leap to the other end of the scale, and to credit him with such utter stupidity as to place hanging evidence where it could not fail to be discovered by the most idiotic policeman? Reserve your balance, Knox. Theories are wild horses. They run away with us. I know that of old, for which very reason I always avoid speculation until I have a solid foundation of fact upon which to erect it." "But, my dear fellow," I cried, "was Camber to foresee that the floor of the hut would be taken up?" Harley sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Do you recollect your first meeting with this man, Knox?" "Perfectly." "What occurred?" "He was slightly drunk." "Yes, but what was the nature of his conversation?" "He suggested that I recognize his resemblance to Edgar Allan Poe." "Quite. What had led him to make this suggestion?" "The manner in which I looked at him, I suppose." "Exactly. Although not quite sober, from a mere glance he was able to detect what you were thinking. Do you wish me to believe, Knox, that this same man had not foreseen what the police would think when Colonel Menendez was found shot within 100 yards of the garden of the guest-house?" I was somewhat taken aback, for Harley's argument was strictly logical, and— "It is certainly very puzzling," I admitted. "Puzzling!" he exclaimed. "It is maddening. This case is like a Syrian village mound. Stratum lies under stratum, and in each we meet with evidence of more refined activity than in the last. It seems we have yet to go deeper." He took out his pipe and began to fill it. "Tell me about the interview with Madame de Stamer," he directed. I took a seat facing him, and he did not once interrupt me throughout my account of Inspector Aylesbury's examination of Madame. "Good," he commented, when I had told how the inspector was dismissed. "But at least, Knox, he has a working theory, to which he sticks like an express to the main line, whereas I find myself constantly called upon to readjust my perspective. Directly I can enjoy freedom of movement. However, I shall know whether my hypothesis is a house of cards or a serviceable structure." "Your hypothesis?" I said. "Then you really have a theory which is entirely different from mine?" "Not entirely different, Knox, merely not so comprehensive. I have contented myself thus far with a negative theory, if I may so express it." "Negative theory?" "Exactly. We are dealing, my dear fellow, with a case of bewildering intricacies. For the moment I have focused upon one feature only." "What is that?" "Upon proving that Colin Camber did not do the murder." "Did not do it?" "Precisely, Knox. Respecting the person, or persons, who did do it, I had preserved a moderately open mind, up to the moment that Inspector Aylesbury entered the library with the Lee Enfield." "And then?" I said eagerly. "Then," he replied, "I began to think hard. However, since I practice what I preach, or endeavour to do so, I must not permit myself to speculate upon this aspect of the matter until I have tested my theory of Camber's innocence." "In other words," I said bitterly, "although you encouraged me to unfold my ideas regarding Mrs. Camber, you were merely laughing at me all the time." "My dear Knox," exclaimed Harley, jumping up impulsively, "please don't be unjust. Is it like me? On the contrary, Knox," he looked me squarely in the eyes, "you have given me a platform on which already I have begun to erect one corner of a theory of the crime. Without new facts I can go no further, but this much at least you have done." "Thanks, Harley," I murmured, and indeed I was gratified. "But where do your other corners rest?" "They rest," he said slowly, "they rest, respectively, upon a batwing, a yew tree, and a Lee Enfield charger loader." Chapter 30. The Seventh Yew Tree. Detective Inspector Wessex arrived at about 5 o'clock, a quiet, resourceful man, highly competent, and having the appearance of an ex-soldier. His respect for the attainments of Paul Harley alone marked him as a student of character. I knew Essex well, and was delighted when Pedro showed him into the library. "Thank God you are here, Wessex," said Harley, when we had exchanged greetings. "At least I can move. Have you seen the local officer in charge?" "No," replied the inspector, "but I gather that I have been requisitioned over his head." "You have," said Harley grimly, "and over the head of the chief constable, too. But I suppose it is unfair to condemn a man for the shortcoming with which nature endowed him. Therefore we must endeavour to let Inspector Aylesbury down as lightly as possible. I have an idea that I heard him return a while ago." He walked out into the hall to make inquiries, and a few moments later I heard Inspector Aylesbury's voice. "Ah, there you are, Inspector Aylesbury," said Harley cheerily. "Will you please step into the library for a moment?" The inspector entered, frowning heavily, followed by my friend. "There is no earthly reason why we should get at loggerheads over this business," Harley continued. "But the fact of the matter is, Inspector Aylesbury, that there are depths in this case to which neither you nor I have yet succeeded in penetrating. You have a reputation to consider, and so have I. Therefore, I am sure you will welcome the cooperation of Detective Inspector Wessex of Scotland Yard, as I do." "What's this? What's this?" said Aylesbury. "I have made no application to London." "Nevertheless, Inspector, it is quite in order," declared Wessex. "I have my instructions here, and I have reported to Market Hilton already. You see, the man you have detained is an American citizen." "What of that?" "Well, he seems to have communicated with his embassy." Wessex glanced significantly at Paul Harley. "And the embassy communicated with the Home Office. You mustn't regard my arrival as any reflection on your ability, Inspector Aylesbury. I am sure we can work together quite agreeably." "Oh," muttered the other, in evident bewilderment. "I see. Well, if that's the way of it, I suppose we must make the best of things." "Good!" cried Wessex heartily. "Now, perhaps you would like to state your case against the detained man." "A sound idea, Wessex," said Paul Harley. "But perhaps, Inspector Aylesbury, before you begin, you would be good enough to speak to the constable on duty at the entrance to the Tudor garden. I am anxious to take another look at the spot where the body was found." Inspector Aylesbury took out his handkerchief and blew his nose loudly, continuing throughout the operation to glare at Paul Harley, and finally, "You are wasting your time, Mr. Harley," he declared, "as Detective Inspector Wessex will be the first to admit when I have given him the facts of my case. Nevertheless, if you want to examine the garden, do so by all means." He turned without another word, and stamped out of the library, across the hall, and into the courtyard. "I will join you again in a few minutes, Wessex," said Paul Harley, following. "Very good, Mr. Harley," Wessex answered. "I know you wouldn't have had me down if the case had been as simple as he seems to think it is." I joined Harley, and we walked together up the gravelled path, meeting Inspector Aylesbury and the constable returning. "Go ahead, Mr. Harley," cried the inspector. If you can find any stronger evidence than the rifle, I shall be glad to take a look at it."
Harley nodded good-humoredly, and together we descended the steps to the sunken garden. I was intensely curious respecting the investigation which Harley had been so anxious to make here, for I recognized that it was associated with something which he had seen from the window of Camber's hut. We walked along the moss-grown path to the sundial, and stood for a moment looking down at the spot where Menendez had lain. Then he stared up the hill toward the guest-house, and finally directing his attention to the yews which lined the sloping bank. 1, 2, 3, 4, he counted, checking them with his fingers. 5, 6, 7. He mounted the bank and began to examine the trunk of one of the trees, whilst I watched him in growing astonishment. Presently he turned and looked down at me. "Not a trace, Knox," he murmured. "Not a trace. Let's try again." He moved along to the yew adjoining that which he had already inspected, but presently shook his head and passed to the next. Then, "Ah!" he cried. "Come here, Knox." I joined him where he was kneeling, staring at what I took to be a large nail, or bolt, protruding from the bark of the tree. "You see?" he exclaimed. "You see?" I stooped, in order to examine the thing more closely, and as I did so, I realized what it was. It was the bullet which had killed Colonel Menendez. Harley stood upright, his face slightly flushed and his eyes very bright. "We shall not attempt to remove it, Knox," he said. "The depth of penetration may have a tale to tell. The wood of the yew tree is one of the toughest British varieties." "But, Harley," I said blankly, as we descended to the path, "this is merely another point for the prosecution of Camber. Unless—" I turned to him in sudden excitement. "The bullet was of different—" "No, no," he murmured. "Nothing so easy as that, Knox. The bullet was fired from a Lee-Enfield beyond doubt." I stared at him uncomprehendingly. "Then I am utterly out of my depth, Harley. It appears to me that the case against Camber is finally and fatally complete. Only the motive remains to be discovered, and I flatter myself that I have already detected this." "I am certainly inclined to think," admitted Harley, "that there is a good deal in your theory." "Then, Harley," I said in bewilderment, "you do believe that Camber committed the murder?" "On the contrary," he replied, "I am certain that he did not." I stood quite still. "You are certain—" I began. "I told you that the test of my theory, Knox, was to be looked for in the 7th yew from the northeast corner of the Tudor garden, did I not?" "You did, and it is there, a bullet fired from a Lee-Enfield rifle. Beyond any possible shadow of a doubt, the bullet which killed Colonel Menendez." "Beyond any possible shadow of doubt, as you say, Knox, the bullet which killed Colonel Menendez. Therefore Camber is guilty?" "On the contrary, therefore Camber is innocent." "What?" "You are persistently overlooking one little point, Knox," said Harley, mounting the steps onto the gravel path. "I spoke of the 7th yew tree from the northeast corner of the garden." "Well?" "Well, my dear fellow, surely you observed that the bullet was embedded in the 9th." I was still groping for the significance of this point when, recrossing the hall, we entered the library again, to find Inspector Aylesbury posed squarely before the mantelpiece, stating his case to Essex. "You see," he was saying, in his most oratorical manner as we entered, "every little detail fits perfectly into place. For instance, I find that a woman, called Mrs. Powys, who for the past 2 years had acted as housekeeper at the guest-house and never taken a holiday, was sent away recently to her married daughter in London. See what that means? Her room is at the back of the house, and her evidence would have been fatal. Ah Tsong, of course, is a liar. I made up my mind about that the moment I clapped eyes on him. Mrs. Camber is the only innocent party. She was asleep in the front of the house when the shot was fired, and I believe her when she says that she cannot swear to the matter of distance." "A very interesting case, Inspector,"
said Wessex, glancing at Harley. "I have not examined the body yet, but I understand that it was a clean wound through the head." "The bullet entered the juncture of the nasal and frontal bones," explained Harley rapidly, "and it came out between the base of the occipital and first cervical. Without going into unpleasant surgical details, the wound was a perfectly straight one. There was no ricochet." "I understand that a regulation rifle was used?" "Yes," said Inspector Aylesbury. "We have it." "And at what range did you say, Inspector?" "Roughly 100 yards." "Possibly less," murmured Harley. "100 yards or less," said Wessex musingly. "And the obstruction met with in the case of a man shot in that way would be—" he looked towards Paul Harley. "Less than if the bullet had struck the skull higher up," was the reply. "It passed clean through." "Therefore," continued Wessex, "I am waiting to hear, Inspector, where you found the bullet lodged." "Eh?" said the Inspector, and he slowly turned his prominent eyes in Harley's direction. "Oh, I see. That's why you wanted to examine the Tudor garden, is it?" "Exactly," replied Harley. The face of Inspector Aylesbury grew very red. "I had deferred looking for the bullet," he explained, "as the case was already as clear as daylight. Probably Mr. Harley has discovered it." "I have," said Harley shortly. "Is it the regulation bullet?" asked Wessex. "It is. I found it embedded in one of the yew trees." "There you are!" exclaimed Aylesbury. "There isn't the ghost of a doubt." Wessex looked at Harley in undisguised perplexity. "I must say, Mr. Harley," he admitted, "that I have never met with a clearer case." "Neither have I," agreed Harley cheerfully. "I am going to ask Inspector Aylesbury to return here after nightfall. There is a little experiment which I should like to make, and which would definitely establish my case." "Your case?" said Aylesbury. "My case, yes." "You're not going to tell me that you still persist in believing Camber to be innocent?" "Not at all. I am merely going to ask you to return at nightfall to assist me in this minor investigation." "If you ask my opinion," said the Inspector, "no further evidence is needed." "I don't agree with you," replied Harley quietly. "Whatever your own ideas upon the subject may be, I, personally, have not yet discovered one single piece of convincing evidence for the prosecution of Camber." "What?" exclaimed Aylesbury, and even Detective Inspector Wessex stared at the speaker incredulously. "My dear Inspector Aylesbury," concluded Harley, "when you have witnessed the experiment which I propose to make this evening, you will realize, as I have already realized, that we are faced by a tremendous task." "What tremendous task?" "The task of discovering who shot Colonel Menendez." End of Chapter 30. Part 11 of Batwing by Sax Rohmer. Read by Mark Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Batwing, Chapter 31. Isola Camber's Confession. Paul Harley, with Wessex and Inspector Aylesbury, presently set out for Market Hilton, where Cullen Camber and Ah Tsong were detained, and where the body of Colonel Menendez had been conveyed for the purpose of the post-mortem. I had volunteered to remain at Cray's Folly, my motive being not wholly an unselfish one. "Refer reporters to me, Mr. Knox," said Inspector Wessex. "Don't let them trouble the ladies, and tell them as little as possible yourself." The drone of the engine having died away down the avenue, I presently found myself alone, but as I crossed the hall in the direction of the library, intending to walk out upon the southern lawns, I saw Val Beverley coming toward me from Madame de Stamer's room. She remained rather pale, but smiled at me courageously. "Have they all gone, Mr. Knox?" she asked. I have really been hiding, I suppose you knew." "I suspected it," I said, smiling. "Yes, they are all gone. How is Madame de Stamer now?" "She is quite calm, curiously, almost uncannily calm. She is writing. Tell me, please, what does Mr. Harley think of Inspector Aylesbury's preposterous ideas?" "He thinks he is a fool," I replied hotly, "as I do." "But whatever will happen if he persists in dragging me into this horrible case?" "He will not drag you into it," I said quietly. "He has been superseded by a cleverer man, and the case is practically under Harley's direction now." "Thank heaven for that," she murmured. "I wonder—" She looked at me hesitatingly. "Yes?" I prompted. "I have been thinking about poor Mrs. Camber all alone in that gloomy house, and wondering—" "Perhaps I know. You are going to visit her?" Val Beverley nodded, watching me. "Can you leave Madame de Stamer with safety?" "Oh yes, I think so. Nita can attend to her." "And may I accompany you, Miss Beverley? For more reasons than one, I too should like to call upon Mrs. Camber." "We might try," she said hesitatingly. "I really only wanted to be kind. You won't begin to cross-examine her, will you?" "Certainly not," I answered, "although there are many things I should like her to tell us." "Well, suppose we go," said the girl, "and let events take their own course." As a result, I presently found myself, Val Beverley by my side, walking across the meadow path. With the unpleasant hush of Cray's Folly left behind, the day seemed to grow brighter. I thought that the skylarks had never sung more sweetly. Yet in this same instant of sheerly physical enjoyment I experienced a pang of remorse, remembering the tragic woman we had left behind, and the poor little sorrowful girl we were going to visit. My emotions were very mingled then, and I retain no recollection of our conversation up to the time that we came to the guest-house. We were admitted by a really charming old lady, who informed us that her name was Mrs. Powys, and that she was but an hour return from London, whither she had been summoned by telegram. She showed us into a quaint, small drawing-room, which owed its atmosphere quite clearly to Mrs. Camber, for whereas the study was indescribably untidy, this was a model of neatness without being formal or unhomely. Here in a few moments Mrs. Camber joined us, an appealing little figure of wistful, almost elfin beauty. I was surprised and delighted to find that an instant bond of sympathy sprang up between the two girls. I diplomatically left them together for a while, going into Camber's room to smoke my pipe. And when I returned— "Oh, Mr. Knox," said Val Beverley, "Mrs. Camber has something to tell you which she thinks you ought to know." "Concerning Colonel Menendez?" I asked eagerly. Mrs. Camber nodded her golden head. "Yes," she replied, but glancing at Val Beverley as if to gather confidence. "The truth can never hurt Colin. He has nothing to conceal. May I tell you?" "I am all anxiety to hear," I assured her. "Would you rather I went, Mrs. Camber?" asked Val Beverley. Mrs. Camber reached across and took her hand. "Please, no," she replied. "Stay here with me. I am afraid it is rather a long story." "Never mind," I said. "It will be time well spent if it leads us any nearer to the truth." "Yes?" she questioned, watching me anxiously. "You think so? I think so too." She became silent, sitting looking straight before her, the pupils of her blue eyes widely dilated. Then, at first in a queer, far-away voice, she began to speak again. "I must tell you," she commenced, "that before my marriage my name was Isabella da Valera." I started. "Isola was my baby way of saying it, and so I came to be called Isola. My father was manager of one of Senor Don Juan's estates in a small island near the coast of Cuba. My mother," she raised her little hands eloquently, "was half-caste, do you know? And she and my father—" She looked pleadingly at Val Beverley. "I understand," whispered the latter with deep sympathy. "But you don't think it makes any difference, do you?" "No," said Mrs. Camber with a quaint little gesture.
To you, perhaps not, but there, where I was born, oh, so much. Well, then, my mother died when I was very little. Ah Tsong was her servant. There are many Chinese in the West Indies, you see, and I can just remember he carried me in to see her. Of course, I didn't understand. My father quarreled bitterly with the priests because they would not bury her in holy ground. I think he no longer believed afterward. I loved him very much. He was good to me, and I was a queen in that little island. All the negroes loved me, because of my mother, I think, who was partly descended from slaves, as they were. But I had not begun to understand how hard it was all going to be when my father sent me to a convent in Cuba. I hated to go, but while I was there, I learned all about myself. I knew that I was outcast. It was," she raised her hand, "not possible to stay. I was only 15 when I came home, but all the same I was a woman. I was no more a child, unhappy no longer. After a while, perhaps, when I forgot what I had suffered at the convent, I became less miserable. My father did all in his power to make me happy, and I was glad the work people loved me. But I was very lonely. Ah Tsong understood."
Her eyes filled with tears.
"Can you imagine," she asked, "that when my father was away in distant parts of the island at night, Ah Tsong slept outside my door? Some of them say, 'Do not trust the Chinese.' I say, except my husband and my father, I have never known another to trust but Ah Tsong. Now they have taken him away from me."
Tears glittered on her lashes, but she brushed them aside angrily and continued.
"I was still less than 20, and looked, they told me, only 14, when Senor Menendez came to inspect his estate. I had never seen him before. There had been a rising in the island in the year after I was born, and he had only just escaped with his life. He was hated. People called him Devil Menendez. Especially no woman was safe from him, and in the old days, when his power had been great, he had used it for wickedness. My father was afraid when he heard he was coming. He would have sent me away, but before it could be arranged, Senor the Colonel arrived. He had in his company a French lady. I thought her very beautiful and elegant. It was Madame de Stamer. It was only 4 years ago, a little more, but her hair was dark brown. She was splendidly dressed, and such a wonderful horsewoman. The first time I saw her, I felt as they had made me feel at the convent. I wanted to hide from her. She was so grand a lady, and I came from slaves."
She paused hesitatingly and stared down at her own tiny feet. "Pardon me interrupting you, Mrs. Camber," I said, "but can you tell me in what way these two are related?" She looked up with her naive smile. "I can tell you, yes. A cousin of Senor Menendez married a sister of Madame de Stamer." "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "A very remote kinship." "It was in this way they met, in Paris, I think, and," she raised her hands expressively, "she came with him to the West Indies, although it was during the Great War. I think she loved him more than her soul, and me, she hated. As Senor Menendez dismounted from his horse in front of the house, he saw me." She sighed and ceased speaking again. Then, "That very night," she continued, "he began, do you know? I was trying to escape from him when Madame de Stamer found us. She called me a shameful name, and my father, who heard it, ordered her out of the house. Senor Menendez spoke sharply, and my father struck him." She paused once more, biting her lip agitatedly, but presently proceeded. "Do you know what they are like, the Spanish, when their blood is hot? Senor Menendez had the revolver, but my father knocked it from his grasp. Then they fought with their bare hands. I was too frightened even to cry out. It was all a horrible dream. What Madame de Stamer did, I do not know. I could see nothing but 2 figures twined together on the floor. At least one of them arose. I saw it was my father, and I remember no more." She was almost overcome by her tragic recollections, but presently, with a wonderful courage, which, together with her daintiness of form, spoke eloquently of good blood on one side at any rate, continued to speak.
My father found we must go to Cuba to make arrangements for the future. Of course, our life there was finished. Ah Tsong stayed with me. You have heard how it used to be in those islands in the old days, but now you think it is so different. I used to think it was different, too. On the first night, my father was away. Ah Tsong, who had gone out, was so long returning, I became afraid. Then a strange negro came with news that he had been taken ill with cholera, and was lying at a place not far from the house. I forgot my fears, and hurried off with these men. Ah!" She laughed wildly. "I do not know I should never return, and I did not know I should never see my father again. To you this must seem all wild and strange, because there is a law in England. There is a law in Cuba, too, but in some of those little islands the only law is the law of the strongest."
She raised her hands to her face, and there was silence for a while.
"Of course it was a trap," she presently continued. "I was taken to an island called El Manas, which belonged to Senor Menendez, and where he had a house. This he could do, but—" She threw back her head proudly. "My spirit he could not break. Lots and lots of money would be mine, and estates of my own. But one thing about him I must tell. He never showed me violence. For 1, 2, 3 weeks I stayed a prisoner in his house. All the servants were faithful to him, and I could not find a friend among them. Although quite innocent, I was ruined, do you know?"
She raised her eyes pathetically to Val Beverley.
"I thought my heart was broken, for something told me my father was dead. This was true."
"What?" I exclaimed.
"You don't mean—" I don't know," she answered brokenly. "He died on his way to Havana. They said it was an accident. Well, at least Senor Menendez offered me marriage. I thought if I agreed, it would give me my freedom, and I could run away and find Ah Tsong."
She paused, and a flush colored her delicate face and faded again, leaving it very pale.
"We were married in the house by a Spanish priest. Oh," she raised her hands pathetically, "do you know what a woman is like? My spirit was not broken still, but crushed. I had now nothing but kindness and gifts. I might never have known, but Senor Menendez, who thought," she smiled sadly, "I was beautiful, took me to Cuba, where he had a great house. Please remember, please," she pleaded, "before you judge of me, that I was so young and had never known love, except the love of my father. I did not even dream then his death was not an accident. I was proud of my jewels and fine dresses, but I began to notice that Juan did not present any of his friends to me. We went about, but to strange places, never to visit people of his own kind, and none came to visit us. Then one night I heard someone on the balcony of my room. I was so frightened I could not cry out. It was good I was like that, for the curtain was pulled open and Ah Tsong came in."
She clutched convulsively at the arms of her chair.
"He told me,"
she said in a very low voice. Then, looking up pitifully,
"Do you know," she asked in her quaint way, "it was a mock marriage. He had done it and thought no shame, because it was so with my mother. Oh!"
Her beautiful eyes flashed, and for the first time since I had met Isola Camber I saw the real Spanish spirit of the woman leap to life.
"He did not know me. Perhaps I did not know myself. That night, with no money, without a ring, a piece of lace, a peseta, anything that had belonged to him, I went with Ah Tsong. We made our way to a half-sister of my father's who lived in Puerto Principe, and at first she would not have me. I was talked about, she said, in all the islands. She told me of my poor father. She told me I had dragged the name of de Valera in the dirt. At last I made her understand that what everyone else had known, I had never even dreamed of."
She looked up wistfully, as if thinking that we might doubt her.
"Do you know?" she whispered. "I know. Oh, I know," said Val Beverley.
I loved her for the sympathy in her voice and in her eyes. "It is very, very brave of you to tell us this, Mrs. Camber." "Yes, do you think so?" asked the girl simply. "What does it matter if it can help Colin?" "This aunt of mine," she presently continued, "was a poor woman, and it was while I was hiding in her house, because spies of Senor Menendez were searching for me, that I met my husband. He was studying in Cuba the strange things he writes about, you see, and before I knew what had happened, I found I loved him more than all else in the world. It is so wonderful, that feeling," she said, looking across at Val Beverley. "Do you know?" The girl flushed deeply and lowered her eyes, but made no reply. "Because you are a woman, too, you will perhaps understand," she resumed. "I did not tell him. I did not dare to tell him at first. I was so madly happy I had no courage to speak. But when—" her voice sank lower and lower, "he asked me to marry him, I told him. Nothing he could ever do would change my love for him now, because he forgave me and made me his wife." I feared that at last she was going to break down, for her voice became very tremulous, and tears leapt again into her eyes. She conquered her emotion, however, and went on. "We crossed over to the States, and Colin's family, who had heard of his marriage, some friend of Senor Menendez had told them, would not know us. It meant that Colin, who would have been a rich man, was very poor. It made no difference. He was splendid, and I was so happy it was all like a dream. He made me forget I was to blame for his troubles. Then we were in Washington, and I saw Senor Menendez in the hotel. Oh, my heart stopped beating. For me it was like the end of everything. I knew he was following me. But he had not seen me, and without telling Colin the reason, I made him leave Washington. He was glad to go. Wherever we went in America they seemed to find out about my mother. I got to hate them all. We came to England, and Cullen heard about this house, and we took it. At last we were really happy. No one knew us. Because we were strange, and because of Ah Tsong, they looked at us very funny, and kept away, but we did not care. Then Sir James Appleton sold Cray's Folly." She looked up quickly. "How can I tell you? It must have been by Ah Tsong that he traced me to Surrey. Some spy had told him there was a Chinaman living here. Oh, I don't know how he found out, but when I heard who was coming to Cray's Folly, I thought I should die. Something I must tell you now. When I had told my story to Colin, one thing I had not told him, because I was afraid what he might do. I had not told him the name of the man who had caused me to suffer so much. On the day I first saw Senor Menendez walking in the garden of Cray's Folly, I knew I must tell my husband what he had so often asked me to tell him, the name of the man. I told him, and at first I thought he would go mad. He began to drink, do you know? It was a failing in his family. But because I knew, I forgave him, and hoped, always hoped, that he would stop. He promised to do so. He had given up going out each day to drink, and was working again like he used to work, too hard, but it was better than the other way." She stopped speaking, and suddenly, before I could divine her intention, dropped upon her knees, and raised her clasped hands to me. He did not kill him!" she cried passionately. "He did not! Oh, God, I who love him tell you he did not! You think he did. You do! I can see it in your eyes." "Believe me, Mrs. Camber," I answered, deeply moved, "I don't doubt your word for a moment." She continued to look at me for a while, and then turned to Val Beverley. "You don't think he did," she sobbed, "do you?" She looked such a child, such a pretty, helpless child, as she knelt there on the carpet, that I felt a lump rising in my throat. Val Beverley dropped down impulsively beside her and put her arms around the slender shoulders. "Of course I don't!" she exclaimed indignantly. "Of course I don't! It's quite unthinkable!" "I know it is," moaned the other, raising her tearful face.
"I love him, and know his great soul. But what do these others know? And they will never believe me." "Have courage," I said. "It has never failed you yet. Mr. Paul Harley has promised to clear him by tonight." "He has promised?" she whispered, still kneeling and clutching Val Beverley tightly. She looked up at me, with hope reborn in her beautiful eyes. "He has promised? Oh, I thank him. May God bless him. I know he will succeed." I turned aside and walked out across the hall and into the empty study. Chapter 32. Paul Harley's Experiment. I recognize that whosoever may have taken the trouble to follow my chronicle thus far will be little disposed to suffer any intrusion of my personal affairs at such a point. Therefore I shall pass lightly over the walk back to Cray's Folly, during which I contrived to learn much about Val Beverley's personal history, but little to advance the investigation which I was there to assist. As I had surmised, Miss Beverley had been amply provided for by her father, and was bound to Madame de Stamer by no other ties than those of friendship and esteem. Very reluctantly I released her on our returning to the house, for she, perforce, hurried off to Madame's room, leaving me looking after her in a state of delightful bewilderment, the significance of which I could not disguise from myself. The absurd suspicions of Inspector Aylesbury were forgotten. So was the shadow upon the blind of Colonel Menendez's study. I only knew that love had come to me, an unbidden guest, to stay forever. Manuel informed me that a number of pressmen, not to be denied, had taken photographs of the Tudor garden and of the spot where Colonel Menendez had been found, but Pedro, following my instructions, had referred them all to Market Hilton. I was standing in the doorway talking to the man when I heard the drone of Harley's motor in the avenue, and a moment later he and Wessex stepped out in front of the porch and joined me. I thought that Wessex looked stern and rather confused, but Harley was quite his old self, his keen eyes gleaming humorously, and an expression of geniality upon his tanned features. "Hullo, Knox," he cried. "Any developments?" "Yes," I said. "Suppose we go up to your room and talk." "Good enough." Inspector Wessex nodded without speaking, and the three of us mounted the staircase and entered Paul Harley's room. Harley seated himself upon the bed and began to load his pipe, whilst Wessex, who seemed very restless, stood staring out of the window. I sat down in the armchair and— "I have had an interesting interview with Mrs. Camber," I said. "What?" exclaimed Harley. "Good. Tell us all about it." Wessex turned, hands clasped behind him, and listened in silence to an account which I gave of my visit to the guest-house. When I had finished, "It seems to me," said the inspector slowly, "that the only doubtful point in the case against Camber is cleared up, namely, his motive." "It certainly looks like it," agreed Harley. "But how strangely Mrs. Camber's story differs from that of Menendez, although there are points of contact. I regret, however, that you were unable to settle the most important matter of all." "You mean whether or not she had visited Cray's Folly?" "Exactly." "Then you still consider my theory to be correct?" I asked eagerly. "Up to a point it has been proved to be," he returned. "I must congratulate you upon a piece of really brilliant reasoning, Knox. But respecting the most crucial moment of all, we are still without information, unfortunately. However, whilst the presence or otherwise of Mrs. Camber in Cray's Folly on the night preceding the tragedy may prove to bear intimately upon the case, an experiment which I propose to make presently will give the matter an entirely different significance." Said Wessex doubtfully. "I am looking forward to this experiment of yours, Mr. Harley, with great interest. To be perfectly honest, I have no more idea than the man in the moon how you hope to clear Camber." "No," replied Harley musingly. "The weight of evidence against him is crushing. But you are a man of great experience, Wessex, in criminal investigations. Tell me honestly,
Have you ever known a murder case in which there was such conclusive material for the prosecution?" "Never," replied the inspector promptly. "In this respect, as in others, the case is unique." "You have seen Camber," continued Harley, "and have been able to form some sort of judgment respecting his character. You will admit that he is a clever man, brilliantly clever. Keep this fact in mind. Remember his studies, and he does not deny that they have included voodoo. Remember his inquiries into the significance of batwing. Remember, as we now learn definitely from Mrs. Camber's evidence, that he was in Cuba at the same time as the late Colonel Menendez, and once, at least, actually in the same hotel in the United States. Consider the rifle found under the floor of the hut, and, having weighed all these points judicially, Wessex, tell me frankly if in the whole course of your experience you have ever met a more perfect frame-up." "What?" shouted Wessex, in sudden excitement. "What?" "I said a frame-up," repeated Harley quietly. "An American term, but one which will be familiar to you." "Good God!" muttered the detective. "You have turned all my ideas upside down." "What may be termed the physical evidence," continued Harley, "is complete, I admit, too complete. There lies the weak spot. But what I will call the psychological evidence points in a totally different direction. A man clever enough to have planned this crime, and Camber undoubtedly is such a man, could not, it is humanly impossible, have been fool enough, deliberately, to lay such a train of damning facts. It's a frame-up, Wessex. I had begun to suspect this even before I met Camber. Having met him, I knew that I was right. Then came an inspiration. I saw where there must be a flaw in the plan. It was geographically impossible that this could be otherwise. "Geographically impossible?" I said in a hushed voice, for Harley had truly astounded me. "Geographical is the term, Knox. I admit that the discovery of the rifle beneath the floor of the hut appalled me." "I could see that it did." "It was the crowning piece of evidence, Knox. Evidence of such fiendish cleverness on the part of those who had plotted Menendez's death that I began to wonder whether, after all, it would be possible to defeat them. I realized that Camber's life hung upon a hair. For the production of that rifle before a jury of 12 moderately stupid men and true could not fail to carry enormous weight, whereas the delicate point upon which my counter-case rested might be more difficult to demonstrate in court. Tonight, however, we shall put it to the test, and there are means, no doubt, which will occur to me later, of making its significance evident to one not acquainted with the locality. The press photographs, which I understand have been taken, may possibly help us in this." Bewildered by my friend's revolutionary ideas, which explained the hitherto mysterious nature of his inquiries, I scarcely knew what to say, but— "If it's a frame-up, Mr. Harley," said Wessex, "and the more I think about it, the more it has that look to me, practically speaking, we have not yet started on the search for the murderer." "We have not," replied Harley grimly, "but I have a dawning idea of a method by which we shall be enabled to narrow down this inquiry." It must be unnecessary for me to speak of the state of suppressed excitement in which we passed the remainder of that afternoon and evening. Dr. Rolleston called again to see Madame de Stamer, and reported that she was quite calm. In fact, he almost echoed Val Beverley's words spoken earlier in the day. "She is unnaturally calm, Mr. Knox," he said in confidence. "I understand that the dead man was a cousin, but I almost suspect that she was madly in love with him." I nodded shortly, admiring his acute intelligence. "I think you are right, Doctor," I replied, "and if it is so, her amazing fortitude is all the more admirable." "Admirable?" he echoed. "As I said before, she has the courage of 10 men." A formal dinner was out of the question, of course. Indeed, no one attempted to dress. Val Beverley excused herself, saying that she would dine in Madame's room, and Harley, Wessex, and I partook of wine and sandwiches in the library. Inspector Aylesbury arrived about 8 o'clock, in a mood of repressed irritation. Pedro showed him in to where the three of us were seated, and, "Good evening, gentlemen," said he. "Here I am, as arranged, but as I am up to my eyes in work on the case, I will ask you, Mr. Harley, to carry out this experiment of yours as quickly as possible." "No time shall be lost," replied my friend quietly. "May I request you to accompany Detective Inspector Wessex and Mr. Knox to the guest-house by the high road? Do not needlessly alarm Mrs. Camber. Indeed, I think you might confine your attention to Mrs. Powys. Merely request permission to walk down the garden to the hut, and be good enough to wait there until I join you, which will be in a few minutes after your arrival." Inspector Aylesbury uttered an inarticulate grunting sound, but I, who knew Harley so well, could see that he felt himself to be upon the eve of a signal triumph. What he proposed to do I had no idea, save that it was designed to clear Colin Camber. I prayed that it might also clear his pathetic girl wife, and in a sort of gloomy silence I set out with Essex and Aylesbury, down the drive, past the lodge, which seemed to be deserted tonight, and along the tree-lined high road, cool and sweet in the dusk of evening. Aylesbury was very morose, and Wessex, who had lighted his pipe, did not seem to be in a talkative mood either. He had the utmost faith in Paul Harley, but it was evident enough that he was oppressed by the weight of evidence against Camber. I divined the fact that he was turning over in his mind the idea of the frame-up, and endeavouring to readjust the established facts in accordance with this new point of view. We were admitted to the guest-house by Mrs. Powys, a cheery old soul, one of those born optimists whose special task in life seems to be that of a friend in need. As she opened the door she smiled, shook her head, and raised her finger to her lips. "Be as quiet as you can, sir," she said. "I have got her to sleep." She spoke of Mrs. Camber as one refers to a child, and, quite understanding her anxiety, "There will be no occasion to disturb her, Mrs. Powys," I replied. "We merely wish to walk down to the bottom of the garden to make a few inquiries." "Yes, gentlemen," she whispered, quietly closing the door as we all entered the hall. She led us through the rear portion of the house, and past the quarters of Ah Tsong into that neglected garden which I remembered so well. "There you are, sir, and may Heaven help you to find the truth." "Rest assured that the truth will be found, Mrs. Powys," I answered. Inspector Aylesbury cleared his throat, but Wessex, puffing at his pipe, made no remark whatever until we were all come to the hut overhanging the little ravine. "This is where I found the rifle, Detective Inspector," explained Aylesbury. Wessex nodded absently. It was another perfect night, with only a faint tracery of cloud to be seen like lingering smoke over the western horizon. Everything seemed very still, so that although we were several miles from the railway line, when presently a train sped on its way, one might have supposed, from the apparent nearness of the sound, that the track was no farther off than the grounds of Cray's Folly. Toward those grounds automatically our glances were drawn, and we stood there staring down at the ghostly map of the gardens, and all wondering, no doubt, what Harley was doing, and when he would be joining us. Very faintly I could hear the water of the little stream bubbling beneath us. Then, just as this awkward silence was becoming intolerable, there came a scraping and scratching from the shadows of the gully, and— "Give me a hand, Knox," cried the voice of Harley from below. "I want to avoid the barbed wire, if possible." He had come across country, and as I scrambled down the slope to meet him, I could not help wondering with what object he had sent us ahead by the high road. Presently, when he came clambering up into the garden, this in a measure was explained, for— "You are all wondering," he began rapidly, "what I am up to, no doubt. Let me endeavour to make it clear. In order that my test should be conclusive, and in no way influenced by pre-knowledge of certain arrangements which I had made, I sent you on ahead of me. Not wishing to waste time, I followed by the shorter route. "And now, gentlemen, let us begin."
"Good,"
muttered Inspector Aylesbury. "But first of all," continued Harley, "I wish each one of you in turn to look out of the window of the hut, and down into the Tudor garden of Cray's Folly. Will you begin, Wessex?" Wessex, taking his pipe out of his mouth, and staring hard at the speaker, nodded, entered the hut, and, kneeling on the wooden seat, looked out of the window. "Open the panes," said Harley, "so that you have a perfectly clear view." Wessex slid the panes open and stared intently down into the valley. "Do you see anything unusual in the garden?" "Nothing," he reported. "And now, Inspector Aylesbury." Inspector Aylesbury stamped noisily across the little hut and peered out briefly. "I can see the garden," he said. "Can you see the sundial?" "Quite clearly." "Good. And now you, Knox." I followed, filled with astonishment. "Do you see the sundial?" asked Harley again. "Quite clearly." "And beyond it?" "Yes, I can see beyond it. I can even see its shadow lying like a black hand on the path." "And you can see the yew trees?" "Of course." "But nothing else? Nothing unusual?" "Nothing." "Very well," said Harley tersely. "And now, gentlemen, we take to the rough ground, proceeding due east. Will you be good enough to follow?" Walking around the hut, he found an opening in the hedge, and scrambled down into the place where rank grass grew, and through which he and I on a previous occasion had made our way to the high road. To-night, however, he did not turn toward the high road, but proceeded along the crest of the hill. I followed him, excited by the novelty of the proceedings. Wessex, very silent, came behind me, and Inspector Aylesbury, swearing under his breath, waded through the long grass at the rear. "Will you all turn your attention to the garden again, please?" cried Harley. We all paused, looking to the right. "Anything unusual?" We were agreed that there was not. "Very well," said my friend. "You will kindly note that from this point onward the formation of the ground prevents our obtaining any other view of Cray's Folly or its gardens until we reach the path to the valley, or turn on to the high road. From a point on the latter the tower may be seen, but that is all. The first part of my experiment is concluded, gentlemen. We will now return." Giving us no opportunity for comment, he plunged on in the direction of the stream, and at a point which I regarded as unnecessarily difficult, crossed it, to the great discomfiture of the heavy Inspector Aylesbury. A few minutes later we found ourselves once more in the grounds of Cray's Folly. Harley, evidently with a definite objective in view, led the way up the terraces, through the rhododendrons, and the round base of the tower. He crossed to the sunken garden, and at the top of the steps paused. "Be good enough to regard the sundial from this point," he directed. Even as he spoke I caught my breath, and I heard Aylesbury utter a sort of gasping sound. Beyond the sundial, and slightly to the left of it, viewed from where we stood, a faint elfin light flickered, at a point apparently some 4 or 5 feet above the ground. "What's this?" muttered Wessex. "Follow again, gentlemen," said Harley quietly. He led the way down to the garden and along the path to the sundial. This he passed, pausing immediately in front of the yew tree in which I knew the bullet to be embedded. He did not speak, but, extending his finger, pointed. A piece of candle, some 4 inches long, was attached by means of a nail to the bark of the tree, so that its flame burned immediately in front of the bullet embedded there. For perhaps 10 seconds no one spoke. Indeed, I think no one moved. Then— "Good God!" murmured Wessex. "You have done some clever things to my knowledge, Mr. Harley, but this crowns them all." "Clever things!" said Inspector Aylesbury. "I think it's a lot of damned tomfoolery." "Do you, Inspector?" asked the Scotland Yard man quietly. "I don't. I think it has saved the life of an innocent man." "What's that? What's that?" cried Aylesbury. "This candle was burning here on the yew tree," explained Harley, "at the time that you looked out of the window of the hut. You could not see it. You could not see it from the crest adjoining the guest-house, the only other spot in the neighborhood from which this garden is visible. Now, since the course of a bullet is more or less straight, and since the nature of the murdered man's wound proves that it was not deflected in any way, I submit that the one embedded in the yew tree before you could not possibly have been fired from the guest-house. The second part of my experiment, gentlemen, will be designed to prove from whence it was fired." Chapter 33. Paul Harley's Experiment Concluded. Up to the very moment that Paul Harley, who had withdrawn, rejoined us in the garden, Inspector Aylesbury had not grasped the significance of that candle burning upon the yew tree. He continued to stare at it as if hypnotized, and when my friend reappeared, carrying a long ash staff and a sheet of cardboard, I could have laughed to witness the expression upon the inspector's face, had I not been too deeply impressed with that which underlay this strange business. Wessex, on the other hand, was watching my friend eagerly, as an earnest student in the classroom might watch a demonstration by some celebrated lecturer. "You will notice," said Paul Harley, "that I have had a number of boards laid down upon the ground yonder, near the sundial. They cover a spot where the turf was worn very thin. Now this garden, because of its sunken position, is naturally damp. Perhaps, Wessex, you would take up these planks for me." Inspector Wessex obeyed, and Harley, laying the ash stick and cardboard upon the ground, directed the ray of an electric torch upon the spot uncovered. "The footprints of Colonel Menendez," he explained. "Here he turned from the tiled path. He advanced 3 paces in the direction of the sundial, you observe, then stood still, facing, we may suppose, since this is the indication of the prints, in a southerly direction." "Straight toward the guest-house," muttered Inspector Aylesbury. "Roughly," corrected Harley. "He was fronting in that direction, certainly, but his head may have been turned either to the right or to the left. You observe from the great depth of the toe marks that on this spot he actually fell. Then here," he moved the light, "is the impression of his knee, and here again." He shone the white ray upon a discoloured patch of grass, and then returned the lamp to his pocket. "I am going to make a hole in the turf," he continued, "directly between these 2 footprints, which seem to indicate that the Colonel was standing in the military position of attention at the moment that he met his death." With the end of the ash stick, which was pointed, he proceeded to do this. "Colonel Menendez," he went on, "stood rather over 6 feet in his shoes. The stick which now stands upright in the turf measures 6 feet, from the chalk mark up to which I have buried it, to the slot which I have cut in the top. Into this slot I now wedge my sheet of cardboard." As he put the sheet of cardboard in the slot which he had indicated, I saw that a round hole was cut in it some 6 inches in diameter. We watched these proceedings in silence. Then, "If you will allow me to adjust the candle, gentlemen," said Harley, "which has burned a little too low for my purpose, I shall proceed to the second part of this experiment." He walked up to the yew tree, and by means of bending the nail upward he raised the flame of the candle level with the base of the embedded bullet. "By heavens!" cried Wessex, suddenly divining the object of these proceedings. "Mr. Harley, this is genius!" "Thank you, Wessex," Harley replied, quietly, but nevertheless he was unable to hide his gratification. "You see my point?" "Certainly." "In 10 minutes we shall know the truth." "Oh, I see," muttered Inspector Aylesbury. "We shall know the truth, eh? If you ask me, the truth, it's this, that we are a set of lunatics." "My dear Inspector Aylesbury," said Harley good-humouredly, "surely you have grasped the lesson of experiment number 1. "Well," admitted the other, "it's funny, certainly. I mean, it wants a lot of explaining, but I can't say I'm convinced." "That's a pity," murmured Wessex, "because I am." "You see, Inspector," Harley continued patiently, "the body of Colonel Menendez as it lay formed a straight line between the sundial and the hut in the garden of the guest-house. That is to say, a line drawn from the window of the hut to the sundial must have passed through the body. Very well. Such an imaginary line, if continued beyond the sundial, would have terminated near the base of the 7th yew tree. Accordingly, I naturally looked for the bullet there. It was not there, but I found it, as you know, in the 9th tree. Therefore, the shot could not possibly have been fired from the guest-house, because the spot in the 9th yew where the bullet had lodged is not visible from the guest-house." Inspector Aylesbury removed his cap and scratched his head vigorously. "In order that we may avoid waste of valuable time," said Harley finally, "let us take a hasty observation from here. As a matter of fact, I have done so already, as nearly as was possible, without employing this rough apparatus." He knelt down beside the yew tree, lowering his head so that the candlelight shone upon the brown, eager face, and looked upward over the top of the sundial and through the hole in the cardboard. "Yes," he muttered, a note of rising excitement in his voice. "As I thought, as I thought. Come, gentlemen, let us hurry." He walked rapidly out of the garden and up the steps, whilst we followed dumb with wonder, or such at any rate was the cause of my own silence. In the hall Pedro was standing, a bunch of keys in his hand, and evidently expecting Harley. "Will you take us by the shortest way to the tower stairs?" my friend directed. "Yes, sir." Doubting, wondering, scarcely knowing whether to be fearful or jubilant, I followed, along a carpeted corridor, and thence, a heavy oaken door being unlocked, across a dusty and deserted apartment, apparently intended for a drawing-room. From this, through a second doorway, we were led into a small, square, unfurnished room, which I knew must be situated near the base of the tower. Yet a third door was unlocked, and— "Here is the stair, sir," said Pedro. In Indian file we mounted to the first floor, to find ourselves in a second, identical room, also stripped of furniture and decorations. Harley barely glanced out of the northern window, shook his head, and— "Next floor, Pedro," he directed. Up we went, our footsteps arousing a cloud of dust from the uncarpeted stairs, and the sound of our movements echoing in hollow fashion around the deserted rooms. Gaining the next floor, Harley, unable any longer to conceal his excitement, ran to the north window, looked out, and— "Gentlemen," he said, "my experiment is complete." He turned, his back to the window, and faced us in the dusk of the room. "Assuming the ash stick to represent the upright body of Colonel Menendez," he continued, "and the sheet of cardboard to represent his head, the hole which I have cut in it corresponds fairly nearly to the position of his forehead. Further, assuming the bullet to have illustrated Euclid's definition of a straight line, such a line, followed back from the yew tree to the spot where the rifle rested, would pass through the hole in the cardboard. In other words, there is only one place from which it is possible to see the flame of the candle through the hole in the cardboard, the place where the rifle rested. Stand here in the left-hand angle of the window and stoop down. Will you come first, Knox?" I stepped across the room, bent down, and stared out of the window, across the Tudor garden. Plainly I could see the sundial with the ash stick planted before it. I could see the piece of cardboard which surmounted it, and, through the hole cut in the cardboard, I could see the feeble flame of the candle nailed to the 9th yew tree. I stood upright, knowing that I had grown pale, and conscious of a moist sensation upon my forehead. "Merciful God!" I said in a hollow voice. "It was from this window that the shot was fired which killed him." End of chapter 33. Part 12 of Batwing, by Sax Rohmer. Read by Mark Nelson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Batwing, Chapter 34, The Creeping Sickness. From the ensuing consultation in the library, we did not rise until close upon midnight. To the turbid intelligence of Inspector Aylesbury, the fact by this time had penetrated that Colin Camber was innocent, that he was the victim of a frame-up, and that Colonel Juan Menendez had been shot from a window of his own house. By a process of lucid reasoning which must have convinced a junior schoolboy, Paul Harley, there in the big library, with its garish bookcases and its Moorish ornaments, had eliminated every member of the household from the list of suspects. His concluding words, I remember, were as follows: "Of the known occupants of Cray's Folly on the night of the tragedy, we now find ourselves reduced to 4, any one of whom, from the point of view of an impartial critic uninfluenced by personal character, question, or motive, or any consideration other than that of physical possibility, might have shot Colonel Menendez. They are, firstly, myself. In order to believe me guilty, it would be necessary to discount the evidence of Knox, who saw me on the gravel path below at the time the shot was fired from the tower window. Secondly, Knox, whose guilt equally could only be assumed by means of eliminating my evidence, since I saw him at the window of my room at the time that the shot was fired. Thirdly, Madame de Stamer. Regarding this suspect, in the first place, she could not have gained access to the tower room without assistance, and in the second place, she was so passionately devoted to the late Colonel Menendez that Dr. Rolleston is of the opinion that her reason may remain permanently impaired by the shock of his death. Fourthly, and lastly, Miss Val Beverley." Over my own feelings, as he had uttered the girl's name, I must pass in silence. Miss Val Beverley is the only one of the 4 suspects who was not in a position to establish a sound alibi, so far as I can see at the moment. But in this case entire absence of motive renders the suspicion absurd. Having dealt with the known occupants, I shall not touch upon the possibility that some stranger had gained access to the house. This opens up a province of speculation which we must explore at greater leisure, for it would be profitless to attempt such an exploration now. Thus the gathering had broken up, Inspector Aylesbury returning to Market Hilton to make his report and to release Colin Camber and Ah Tsong, and Wessex to seek his quarters at the Lavender Arms. I remember that, having seen them off, Harley and I stood in the hall, staring at one another in a very odd way, and so we stood when Val Beverley came quietly from Madame de Stamer's room and spoke to us. "Pedro has told me what you have done, Mr. Harley," she said in a low voice. "Oh, thank God you have cleared him. But what in heaven's name does your new discovery mean?" "You may well ask," Harley answered grimly. "If my first task was a hard one, that which remains before me looks more nearly hopeless than anything I have ever been called upon to attempt." "It is horrible, said the girl shudderingly. "Oh, Mr. Knox," she turned to me, "I have felt all along that there was some stranger in the house. You have told me so." "Conundrums, conundrums," muttered Harley irritably. "Where am I to begin? Upon what am I to erect any feasible theory?" He turned abruptly to Val Beverley. "Does Madame de Stamer know?" "Yes," she answered, nodding her head. "And, hearing the others depart, she asked me to tell you that sleep is impossible until you have personally given her the details of your discovery." "She wishes to see me?" asked Harley eagerly. "She insists upon seeing you," replied the girl, "and also requests Mr. Knox to visit her." She paused, biting her lip. "Madame's manner is very, very odd. Dr. Rolleston cannot understand her at all. I expect he has told you? She has been sitting there for hours and hours, writing." "Writing?" exclaimed Harley. "Letters?" "I don't know what she has been writing," confessed Val Beverley. "She declines to tell me, or to show me what she has written, but there is quite a little stack of manuscript upon the table beside her bed. Won't you come in?" I could see that she was more troubled than she cared to confess, and I wondered if Dr. Rolleston's unpleasant suspicions might have solid foundation, and if the loss of her cousin had affected Madame de Stamer's brain. Presently, then, ushered by Val Beverley, I found myself once more in the violet and silver room in which on that great bed of state Madame reclined amid silken pillows. Her art never deserted her, not even in moments of ultimate stress, and that she had prepared herself for this interview was evident enough. I had thought previously that one night of horror had added 5 years to her apparent age. I thought now that she looked radiantly beautiful. That expression in her eyes, which I knew I must forevermore associate with the memory of the dying tigress, had faded entirely. They remained still, as of old, but to-night they were velvety soft. The lips were relaxed in a smile of tenderness. I observed, with surprise, that she wore much jewellery, and upon her white bosom gleamed the famous rope of pearls which I knew her to treasure above almost anything in her possession. Again the fear touched me coldly that much sorrow had made her mad. But at her very first word of greeting I was immediately reassured. "Ah, my friend," she said, as I entered, a caressing note in her deep, vibrant voice. "You have great news, they tell me. Mr. Harley, I was afraid that you had deserted me, sir. If you had done so, I should have been very angry with you. Set the 2 armchairs here on my right, Val, dear, and sit close beside me." Then, as we seated ourselves, "You are not smoking, my friends," she continued, "and I know that you are both so fond of a smoke." Paul Harley excused himself, but I accepted a cigarette which Val Beverley offered me from a silver box on the table, and presently— "I am here like a prisoner of the Bastille," declared Madame, shrugging her shoulders, "where only echoes reach me. Now, Mr. Harley, tell me of this wonderful discovery of yours." Harley inclined his head gravely, and in that succinct fashion which he had at command acquainted Madame with the result of his 2 experiments. As he completed the account, "Ah," she sighed, and lay back upon her pillows, "so to-night he is again a free man, the poor Colin Camber. And his wife is happy once more?" "Thank God," I murmured. Her sorrow was pathetic. "Only the pure in heart can thank God," said Madame strangely. "But I, too, am glad. I have written here—" She pointed to a little heap of violet notepaper upon a table placed at the opposite side of the bed—"how glad I am." Harley and I stared vaguely across the table. I saw Val Beverley glancing uneasily in the same direction. Save for the writing materials and little heap of manuscript, it held only a cup and saucer, a few sandwiches, and a medicine bottle containing the prescription which Dr. Rolleston had made up for the invalid. "I am curious to know what you have written, Madame," declared Harley. "Yes, you are curious?" she said. "Very well, then, I will tell you, and afterward you may read if you wish." She turned to me. "You, my friend," she whispered, and reaching over she laid a jewelled hand upon my arm. "You have spoken with Isola la Verera this afternoon, they tell me." "With Mrs. Camber?" I asked, startled. "Yes, that is true." "Ah, Mrs. Camber," murmured Madame. "I knew her as Isola da Verera. She is beautiful in her golden doll way. You think so?" Then, ere I had time to reply, "She told you, I suppose, eh?" "She told me," I replied with a certain embarrassment, "that she had met you some years ago in Cuba." "Ah, yes, although I told the fat inspector it was not so. How we lie, we women! And of course she told you in what relation I stood to Juan Menendez?" "She did not, Madame de Stamer." "No, no? Well, it was nice of her. No matter, I will tell you. I was his mistress." She spoke without bravado, but quite without shame, seeming to glory in the statement.
I met him in Paris," she continued, half closing her eyes. "I was staying at the house of my sister, and my sister, you understand, was married to one's cousin. That is how we met. I was married. Yes, it is true. But in France, our parents find our husbands, and our lovers find our hearts. Yet sometimes these marriages are happy. To me this good thing had not happened, and in the moment when one's hand touched mine, a living fire entered into my heart, and it has been burning ever since, burning, burning, always till I die. Very well, I am a shameless woman, yes, but I have lived, and I have loved, and I am content. I went with him to Cuba, and from Cuba to another island where he had estates, and the name of which I shall not pronounce, because it hurts me so, even yet. There he set eyes upon Isola de Valera, the daughter of his manager, and poof!" She shrugged and snapped her fingers. "He was like that, you understand. I knew it well. They did not call him Devil Menendez for nothing. There was a scene, a dreadful scene, and after that another, and yet a third. I have pride. If I had seemed to forget it, still it was there. I left him, and went back to France. I tried to forget. I entered upon works of charity for the soldiers at a time when others were becoming tired. I spent a great part of my fortune upon establishing a hospital, and this child," she threw her arm around Val Beverley, "worked with me day and night. I think I wanted to die. Often I tried to die. Did I not, dear?" "You did, madame," said the girl in a very low voice. "Twice I was arrested in the French lines, where I had crept dressed like a poilu, for where I shot down many a Prussian. Is it not so?" "It is true," answered the girl, nodding her head. "They caught me and arrested me," said Madame with a sort of triumph. "If it had been the British," she raised her hand in that Bernhardt gesture, "with me it would have gone hard. But in France a woman's smile goes farther than in England. I had had my fun. They called me good comrade. Perhaps I paid with a kiss. What does it matter? But they heard of me, those Prussian dogs. They knew and could not forgive. How often did they come over to bomb us, Val, dear?" "Oh, many, many times," said the girl shudderingly. "And at last they succeeded," added Madame bitterly. "God, the black villains! Let me not think of it." She clenched her hands and closed her eyes entirely, but presently resumed again. "If they had killed me, I should have been glad, but they only made of me a cripple. Monsieur de Stemmer had been killed a few weeks before this. I am sorry I forgot to mention it. I was a widow. And when after this catastrophe I could be moved, I went to a little villa belonging to my husband at Nice to gain strength, and this child came with me like a ray of sunshine. Here, to wake the fire in my heart, came Juan, deserted, broken, wounded in soul, but most of all in pride, in that evil pride which belongs to his race, which is so different from the pride of France, but for which all the same I could never hate him. Isola de Valera had run away from his great house in Cuba. Yes, a woman had dared to leave him, the man who had left so many women. To me it was pathetic. I was sorry for him. He had been searching the world for her. He loved this little golden-haired girl as he had never loved me. But to me he came with his broken heart, and I—" her voice trembled, "I took him back. He still cared for me, you understand? Ah," she laughed, "I am not a woman who is lightly forgotten. But the great passion that burned in his Spanish soul was revenge. He was a broken man, not only in mind, but in body. Let me tell you, in that island, which I have not named, there is a horrible disease called by the natives the creeping sickness. It is supposed to come from a poisonous place named the Black Belt, and a part of this Black Belt is near, too near, to the hacienda in which Juan sometimes lived."
Paul Harley started and glanced at me significantly.
"They think, those simple Negroes, that it is witchcraft, voodoo, the work of the obeah man. It is of two kinds, rapid and slow. Those who suffer from the first kind just decline and die in great agony. Others recover, or seem to do so. It is, I suppose, a matter of constitution. Juan had had this sickness and had recovered, or so the doctor said. But,
She lay back, shaking her finger characteristically.
in 1 year, in 2, 3, a swift pain comes, like a needle, you understand? Perhaps in the foot, in the hand, in the arm. It is exquisite, deathly while it lasts, but it only lasts for a few moments. It is agony, and then it goes, leaving nothing to show what had caused it. But, my friends, it is a death warning.
"If it comes here," she raised one delicate white hand,
"you may have 5 years to live. If in the foot, 10 or more. But," she sank her voice dramatically, "the nearer it is to the heart, the less are the days that remain to you of life."
"You mean that it recurs?" asked Harley.
"Perhaps in a week, perhaps not for another year, it comes again, that quick agony. This time in the shoulder, in the knee. It is the second warning. 3 times it may come, 4 times, but at last," she laid her hand upon her breast, "it comes here, in the heart, and all is finished."
She paused, as if exhausted, closing her eyes again, whilst we 3 who listened looked at one another in an awe-stricken silence, until the vibrant voice resumed.
"There is only one man in Europe who understands this thing, this creeping sickness. He is a Frenchman who lives in Paris. To him one had been, and he had told him, this clever man, if you are very quiet and do not exert yourself, and only take as much exercise as is necessary for your general health, you have 1 year to live."
"My God!" groaned Harley.
"Yes, such was the verdict, and there is no cure. The poor sufferer must wait and wait, always wait for that sudden pang, not knowing if it will come in his heart and be the finish. Yes, this living death, then, and revenge were the things ruling Juan's life at the time of which I tell you. He had traced Isola de Valera to England. A chance remark in a London hotel had told him that a Chinaman had been seen in a Surrey village, and of course had caused much silly chatter. He inquired at once, and he found out that Colin Camber, the man who had taken Isola from him, was living with her at the guest-house here on the hill. How shall I tell you the rest?"
"Merciful heaven!" exclaimed Harley, his glance set upon her, with a sort of horror in his grey eyes. "I think I can guess." She turned to him rapidly.
"Monsieur Harley," she said, "you are a clever man. I believe you are a genius. And I have the strength to tell you, because I am happy tonight. Because of his great wealth Juan succeeded in buying Gray's Folly from Sir James Appleton, to whom it belonged. He told everybody he leased it, but really he bought it. He paid him more than twice its value, and so obtained possession. But the plan was not yet complete, although it had taken form in that clever, wicked brain of his. Oh, I could tell you stories of the Menendez, and of the things they have done for love and revenge, which even you, who know much of life, would doubt, I think. Yes, you would not believe. But to continue, shall I tell you upon what terms he had returned to me, eh? I will. Once more he would suffer that pang of death in life, for he had courage, such great courage, And then, when the waiting for the next grew more than even his fearless heart could bear, I, who also had courage, and who loved him, should—" She paused. "Do you understand?"
Harley nodded dumbly, and suddenly I found Val Beverley's little fingers twined about mine.
"I agreed," continued the deep voice. "It was a boon which I too would have asked from one who loved me. But to die, knowing another cherished the woman who had been torn from him, was an impossibility for Juan Menendez. What he had schemed to do at first I never knew, but presently, because of our situation here, and because of that which he had asked of me, it came, the great plan. On the night he told me, a night I shall never forget, I drew back in horror from him, I, Marie d'Estamer, who thought I knew the blackest that was in him. I shrank. And because of that scene, it came to him again in the early morning, the moment of agony, the needle pain, here, low down in his left breast. He pleaded with me to do the wicked thing that he had planned, and because I dared not refuse, knowing he might die at my feet, I consented. But, my friends, I had my own plan too, of which he knew nothing. On the next day he went to Paris, and was told he had 2 months to live, with such great care, but perhaps only a week, a day, if he should permit his hot passions to inflame that threatened heart. Very well. I said yes, yes to all that he suggested, and he began to lay the trail to lead to his enemy. It was his hobby, this vengeance. He was like a big, cruel boy. It was he himself, Juan Menendez, who broke into Cray's folly. It was he who nailed the bat-wing to the door. It was he who brought 2 rifles of a kind of which so many millions were made during the war that anybody might possess one. And it was he who concealed the first of these, 1 cartridge discharged, under the floor of the hut in the garden of the West House. The other, which was to be used, he placed—"
"In the shutter case of one of the tower rooms," continued Paul Harley. "I know. I found it there tonight."
"What?" I asked. "You found it, Harley?"
"I returned to look for it," he said. "At the present moment it is upstairs in my room."
"Ah, Monsieur Harley," exclaimed Madame, smiling at him radiantly, "I love your genius. Then it was," she continued, "that he thought himself ready for revenge, and ready for death. He summoned you, Monsieur Harley, to be an expert witness. He placed with you evidence which could not fail to lead to the arrest of Monsieur Cambert. Very well. I allowed him to do all this. His courage, mon Dieu, how I worshipped his courage! At night, when everyone slept, and he could not drop the mask, I have seen what he suffered. I have begged him upon my knees, to allow me to end it then and there, to forget this dream of revenge, to die without this last stain upon his soul. But he, expecting at any hour, at any minute, to know again the agony which cannot be described, which is unlike any other suffered by the flesh, refused. And I—" she raised her eyes ecstatically, "I have worshipped this courage of his, although it was evil, bad. The full moon gives the best light, and so he planned it for the night of the full moon. But on the night before, because of some scene which he had with you, Monsieur Harley, nearly I thought his plans would come to nothing. Nearly I thought the last act of love which he asked of me would never be performed. He sat there, up in that little room which he liked best, the coldness upon him which always came before the pang, waiting, a deathly dew on his forehead, for the end. And I, who loved him better than life, watched him. And so fate willed it, the pang never came."
"You watched him?" I whispered. Harley turned to me slowly. "Don't you understand, Knox?" he said in a voice curiously unlike his own.
"Ah, my friend," Madame de Stamer laid her hand upon my arm with that caressing gesture which I knew. "You do understand, don't you? The power to use my limbs returned to me during the last week that I lived in Nice."
She bent forward and raised her face in an almost agonized appeal to Val Beverley.
My dear," she said, forgive me, but I loved him so. One day, I think," her glance sought my face, "you will know. Then you will forgive me."
"Oh, madame, madame," whispered the girl, and began to sob silently. "Is it enough?" asked Madame de Stamer, raising her hand and looking defiantly at Paul Harley.
"Last night, you, Monsieur Harley, who have genius, nearly brought it all to nothing. You passed the door in the shrubbery just when one was preparing to go out. I was watching from the window above. Then, when you had gone, he came out, smoking his last cigarette. I went to my place, entering the tower room by the door from that corridor. I opened the window. It had been carefully oiled. It was soundless. I was cold as one already dead, but love made me strong. I had seen him suffer. I took the rifle from its hiding-place, the heavy rifle which so few women could use. It was no heavier than some which I had used before, and to good purpose."
Again she paused, and I saw her lips trembling. Before my mind's eye the picture arose which I had seen from Harley's window, the picture of Colonel Juan Menendez walking in the moonlight along the path to the sundial, with halting steps, with clenched fists, but upright as a soldier on parade, walking on dauntlessly to his execution. Out of a sort of haze, which seemed to obscure both sight and hearing, I'd heard Madame speaking again.
"He turned his head toward me. He threw a kiss, and I fired. Did you think a woman lived who could perform such a deed, eh? If you did not think so, it is because you have never looked into the eyes of one who loved her with her body, her mind, and with her soul. I think I went mad. The rifle I remember I replaced, but I remember no more. Ah!"
She sighed in a resigned, weary way, untwined her arm from about Val Beverley, and falling back upon her pillows.
"It is all written here," she said, "every word of it, my friends, and signed at the bottom. I am a murderess, and it was a merciful deed. You see, I had a plan of which Juan knew nothing. This was my plan."
She pointed to the heap of manuscript.
"I would give him relief from his agonies, yes, for although he was an evil man, I loved him better than life. I would let him die happy, thinking his revenge complete. But others to suffer? No, no, 1,000 times no. Ah, I am so tired."
She took up the little medicine bottle, poured its contents into the glass, and emptied it at a draught. Paul Harley, as though galvanized, sprang to his feet. "My God!" he cried huskily. "Stop her! Stop her!" Val Beverley, now desperately white, clutched at me with quivering fingers, her agonized glance set upon the smiling face of Madame de Stamer.
"No fuss, dear friends," said Madame gently. "No trouble, no nasty stomach pumps, for it is useless. I shall just fall asleep in a few moments now, and when I wake, Juan will be with me."
Her face was radiant. It became lighted up magically. I knew in that grim hour what a beautiful woman Madame de Stamer must have been. She rested her hand upon Val Beverley's head, and looked at me with her strange, still eyes.
"Be good to her, my friend," she whispered. "She is English, but not cold like some. She too can love."
She closed her eyes and dropped back upon her pillows for the last time. Chapter 35. An Afterword. This shall be a brief afterword, for I have little else to say. As Madame had predicted, all antidotes and restoratives were of no avail. She had taken enough of some drug, which she had evidently had in her possession for this very purpose, to ensure that there should be no awakening, and although Dr. Rolleston was on the spot within half an hour, Madame de Stamer was already past human aid. There are perhaps one or two details which may be of interest. For instance, as a result of the post-mortem examination of Colonel Menendez, no trace of disease was discovered in any of the organs, but from information supplied by his solicitors, Harley succeeded in tracing the Paris specialist to whom Madame de Stamer had referred, and he confirmed her statement in every particular. The disease, to which he gave some name which I have forgotten, was untraceable, he declared, by any means thus far known to science. As we had anticipated, the bulk of Colonel Don Juan's wealth he had bequeathed to Madame de Stamer, and she in turn had provided that all of which she might die possessed should be divided between certain charities and Val Beverley. I thus found myself at the time when all these legal processes terminated, engaged to marry a girl as wealthy as she was beautiful. Therefore, except for the many grim memories which it had left with me, nothing but personal good fortune resulted from my sojourn at Cray's Folly, beneath the shadow of that bat-wing, which had had no existence outside the cunning imagination of Colonel Juan Menendez. The End of Bat-Wing by Sax Rohmer.